Beneath the crowns and corsets, behind the velvet curtains and royal portraits, lies a truth scrubbed clean from the textbooks. The bodies of kings and queens were far from pristine. For centuries, English royals ruled empires while quietly battling lice, ulcers, rot, and the sheer inconvenience of being human. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a scented handkerchief over a festering reality. So lean in, because these 25 royals didn't just carry the weight of the crown. They carried the smell of history, and no amount of rosewater could hide it. Before we peel back the powdered wigs and lift the lid on centuries of royal discomfort, take a second to hit subscribe. It helps keep these strange stories alive. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight? Noon? Somewhere between tea and madness? Let's find out who's listening, and when. 1. King John. History doesn't remember King John for his personal magnetism, not because he lacked charm, though he did, but because history doesn't write scented margins into royal charters. It catalogs wars and documents taxes and builds entire mythologies out of sword points and seals. But it doesn't tell you what a king smelled like after riding for 8 days straight through rain-swamped Midlands without a change of underclothes. It doesn't tell you if the man who signed the Magna Carta also signed his sheets with the stink of trench foot, dysentery, and fever sweat. Not directly, anyway. And yet, with King John, we can smell the rot seeping through the margins. By the time John came to the throne in 1199, England wasn't yet a place of palaces and pipe systems. It was a portable court, constantly on the move, lurching between manors, abbeys, and castles like a royal circus where the lions had gout and the jesters were armed. Sanitation was an afterthought, and royal hygiene was not a matter of personal preference but of logistical survival. You washed when the rivers weren't frozen, when the servants didn't die of plague, and when your physicians weren't leeching you to correct an imbalance of black bile. In John's case, those imbalances weren't metaphorical. The chroniclers of his reign weren't kind. They didn't accuse him of stink directly. They were subtler than that. They accused him of being a glutton, of falling sick at suspiciously convenient times, of behaving like a beast of appetite. Roger of Wendover, one of the era's most damning voices, paints John as a tyrant rather than a king, one who died in disgrace, bloated and bedraggled after stuffing himself with peaches and ale during a military retreat. The subtext. John didn't just betray his nobles, he also offended the senses. To understand what hygiene meant for John, you have to understand what a royal body was in the early 13th century. It wasn't a private object. It was a site of performance and power, maintained by a small army of servants who carried bowls of heated water, linens, and herbal infusions to wherever the king happened to set up camp. A royal bath wasn't a soak. It was a procession. It meant perfumed hands, rinsed feet, maybe even a gentle scraping of the scalp to remove lice or dead skin. These were not daily rituals. They were ceremonial, occasional, and sometimes medical. John's itinerant lifestyle, spending more than half of every year on the road, meant that even these sparse rituals could fall by the wayside, especially during campaigns, where the mud and filth of wartime logistics turned even the cleanest man into a living compost heap within days. Which raises the question, was John dirty because he wanted to be, or because he couldn't afford not to be? He died, infamously, in 1216, during one of the worst military breakdowns of his reign. The campaign against rebellious barons and a French invasion had pushed him across flooded rivers and collapsing marshland in eastern England. Food was scarce. Morale was lower. According to tradition, and some historians who stress the uncertainty of this account, John contracted dysentery during the retreat, worsened it with overindulgence, and died in a feverish haze. The description varies by source. Some say he lost control of his bowels. Others say he simply collapsed. But all suggest a body overwhelmed by illness, indulgence, and exhaustion. There is no direct record of his hygiene. No monk peeked into the king's tent and wrote, "He hadn't bathed in a week." But the silence speaks volumes. In an age where bodily order was equated with moral order, the fact that John's body was so often associated with collapse of health, of temper, of self-control, suggests he may have violated the unspoken codes of royal presentation. He ruled not with dignity, but with appetite, not with restraint, but with rancor. And when his body finally failed him, it did so in a way that emphasized the grotesque, uncontrolled, leaking, bloated. And yet, perhaps the most damning testimony comes not from the illness that killed him, but from how little his death shocked anyone. Here was a king who had extorted his nobles, lost Normandy, excommunicated himself from the church, and betrayed every living family member he could get his hands on. When he died, there was no dramatic collapse of a great man, only a sigh of relief from a nation that had held its nose for nearly 2 decades. If the moral of John's hygiene is that filth doesn't shock, it corrodes, then his reign is the perfect example. He wasn't one of those grand grotesques whose body became spectacle. He didn't bleed visibly or collapse in his own perfumes like later kings might. He simply wore out his welcome, one fetid mile at a time. And here's the kicker. Despite the body count, the scandals, and the general scent of decay, John's household administration was relatively sophisticated. He kept records. He managed a logistical system that supplied the court with food, water, and linens. He had access to everything needed to maintain a royal standard of bodily care. He just didn't inspire the kind of reverence that turned routine washing into sacred ritual. No one bothered to write about his rose-scented hand towels or lavender-sprinkled pillows. If they existed, they went unremarked. And in history, unremarked means unremembered. So what does it mean when a king has access to cleanliness but dies remembered as something foul? It means the stench wasn't just on his body. It was on his name. And perhaps that's why John rarely appears in textbooks as a case study in royal hygiene. Because to include him would require admitting that the machinery of kingship was always just one infected ulcer away from collapse. That sovereignty didn't come with soap. That the divine right of kings could rot like any other flesh in a humid tent by a riverbank. But if King John's downfall was written in the dirt beneath his fingernails, his successors were no better at keeping their crowns and their odors clean. Because next comes a king whose critics didn't just call him dirty. They called him unfit to rule. And in medieval England, that was more dangerous than a battlefield full of mud. 2. Edward II. If history is a mirror, then Edward VI's reflection was cracked from the start. Not because he was weak, not even because he lost battles or made foolish political decisions, which he did, with flair, but because he made people uncomfortable. A king out of step with the performance of kingship. A man whose body, habits, and preferences, his whole physical presence, seemed to whisper something unspoken and to his contemporaries, unspeakable. And nothing made medieval chroniclers more creative than a king who confused them. Edward II's reign, 1307 to 1327, is usually remembered for 2 things: losing to the Scots at Bannockburn and losing the loyalty of his barons. But behind the military embarrassment and political betrayals was a king whose public image became, over time, inseparable from accusations of slovenliness. He wasn't described as dirty in the sense of being covered in filth. No one caught him trudging through the muck with his trousers soaked in soup. Instead, his dirtiness was a vibe. A cultivated image of something off, something unkempt, something out of place. And in the royal court, being out of place was as damning as being out of your mind. We know from contemporary accounts that Edward had unusual interests. He liked rowing, personally, as in doing it himself. He enjoyed the company of artisans, carpenters, and that most deeply suspicious social group in 14th century England, common people. He built relationships with his servants and lavished attention on his favorites, the most famous of whom, Piers Gaveston, became a lightning rod for rumors, resentment, and rhetorical attacks. That's where the hygiene accusations begin to take shape. Royal dignity in this era was a visual and olfactory construct. It was about fabrics and fragrances, posture and polish. A king was supposed to glide through his court like a walking reliquary, clean, scented, aloof, sacred. Edward, on the other hand, slouched. He laughed in public. He preferred manual labor to ceremonial grace. There are references to him spending time with sailors, ditching courtly dress, and even digging ditches, literally. Now, none of that is inherently unclean. But to the barons who expected gold-threaded robes and liturgical gravity, a king who acted like a field hand might as well have wiped his hands on the throne cushion. So the stories began to snowball. Writers like the author of the Vita Edwardi Secundi took aim at Edward's court through the language of disorder. The problem wasn't just that Edward loved Piers Gaveston, it was that he seemed to love chaos. Court rituals were disrupted, noble expectations were disregarded. The body of the king, which was supposed to embody divine order, seemed to repel that order. The slippage between political deviance and physical untidiness became rhetorical gold for critics. Edward wasn't just poorly advised, he was unwashed, unfit, unworthy. And this is where we hit a problem for historians: the bias of the sources. Many of the surviving accounts of Edward's personal habits come from writers who hated him. These chroniclers weren't trying to create an objective record of hygiene. They were trying to smear a king who defied their sense of decorum. And the easiest way to smear a king was to suggest he was literally smeared. Think of it as medieval PR warfare. You can't accuse the king of moral filth without hinting at physical filth. They go hand in hand. Or in Edward's case, hand in gutter. But even if the slovenly image was exaggerated, it wasn't created from thin air. Edward's disregard for courtly display and ritual was real. His lack of interest in the performative hygiene of kingship, fresh linens, regular shaving, manicured appearances, would have been obvious. He was a physical man in a symbolic role. That tension, that mismatch, created unease. And unease breeds rumor. By the time his rule began to unravel in the 1320s, hygiene had become one thread in a larger tapestry of disgust. His reliance on Hugh Despencer the Younger, his conflicts with Queen Isabella, and his failure to project competent kingship all contributed to an atmosphere in which every detail of his private life became suspicious. His diet, his bed, his wardrobe, his habits. Anything that could be interpreted as not quite kingly was seized upon as evidence of failure. The end of Edward's reign was not just political, it was physical. He was captured, imprisoned, and forced to abdicate in favor of his son. His body, once the symbol of authority, became a political liability. And while his death in 1327 has become the stuff of grim and often lurid legend, most modern historians agree. The truth is less theatrical, more mundane. He was disposed of quietly, his body washed away from the throne like a stain on royal dignity. But the stain lingered in the form of his legacy, because Edward II complicates the idea that hygiene was just about dirt. He wasn't filthy by medieval standards. He was unsettling, disordered, unmanly in the eyes of his critics. And so his body, his face, his posture, his clothes became coded as wrong. The same way a crooked picture frame drives some people mad, Edward's failure to fit the royal mold made people see everything he touched as tainted, including his body. If the first King John smelled like military failure and festering wounds, Edward II reeked of something more insidious, discomfort. He didn't embody filth. He embodied the kind of confusion that feels dirty because it can't be named. The failure of hygiene not as absence of soap, but as absence of form, of function, of narrative. That's why textbooks skip over his personal life, because the story can't be told without wandering into territory that still feels sticky. Gender roles, bodily decorum, and the instability of performance. It's easier to say he lost Scotland than to explain why a king rowing a boat made chroniclers sweat. But if Edward's real hygiene crimes were crimes of appearance, of vibe, Then what came next was a return to obsessive control. Silk, scents, carefully curated appearances. A king who wrapped himself in gold and tried to exude order through every carefully draped fold of linen. He would die in exile, deposed and discarded. But his successor? His successor would be clean. So clean, in fact, he might just be hiding something. If you're still here after that royal roller coaster, you're exactly our kind of curious. Go ahead and hit subscribe. It keeps these forgotten histories rolling in. And tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it as you listen? We're building a global watch party for the wonderfully weird. 3. Richard II. If Edward II unsettled his court by refusing to perform kingship properly, Richard II responded by overperforming it. Excessively, obsessively, as if cleanliness, presentation, and ritual could be stacked so high that they would barricade him from chaos itself. Where Edward's body became a site of discomfort, Richard's body became a stage set, draped, scented, choreographed, and constantly adjusted, like a fragile altar that needed dusting every 5 minutes. Richard II ruled England from 1377 to 1399, ascending the throne as a child in the aftermath of plague, peasant revolt, and a society already twitchy about disorder. This context matters. When you grow up in a world where half the population recently died and social hierarchy briefly collapsed, you don't just fear dirt. You fear contamination. You fear the wrong bodies getting too close. You fear that disorder is catching. Richard's answer to that fear was control, especially of his own physical presence. This is where hygiene enters the story, not as grime, but as obsession. Richard II is one of the first English monarchs whose household records begin to whisper details about daily life. Not shout. Whisper. And what they whisper is linen, lots of it, fresh shirts, carefully laundered underclothes, elaborate bedding, scented chambers, controlled access, restricted proximity. The king's body was to be insulated from the world by layers of fabric, fragrance, and protocol. Not because he was dirty, but because dirt was political. In Richard's court, clean did not mean washed skin. It meant separation. Full immersion bathing was still rare and sometimes medically discouraged, but Richard compensated with linen changes so frequent they drew comment. Linen absorbed sweat, oils, and odors. It was the true hygiene technology of the late medieval elite. A clean king was a king whose linen was changed, aired, beaten, and replaced with almost ritualistic care. And Richard wanted that cleanliness visible. He wanted it theatrical, which is exactly why it annoyed everyone. His contemporaries mocked him not for being unwashed, but for being precious, effeminate, overly concerned with appearances. Chroniclers sneered at his love of fine clothes, his insistence on ceremony, his demand that subjects show exaggerated deference. One famously hostile account describes his court as suffocatingly formal, a place where even approaching the king felt like trespassing into a scented shrine. And here's the irony. All of this obsessive presentation was framed by his enemies as moral weakness. In a culture that equated restraint with virtue, Richard's fastidiousness looked suspiciously like indulgence. The same clean linens that signaled royal order also signaled excess. Why so many shirts? Why so much perfume? Why so much effort to manage the king's body when the kingdom itself was in turmoil? The accusation, unspoken but clear, was this: Richard was laundering himself while England rotted. Unlike Edward II, Richard didn't invite accusations of dirt through casualness. He invited them through distance. He didn't mingle. He withdrew. He elevated his body above others, literally and symbolically. Even his meals became spectacles of separation, with elaborate service rituals that emphasized how untouchable the king was. Touch, physical, social, symbolic, was controlled like a biohazard. This obsession with separation had a hygiene logic behind it. The late 14th century was still deeply shaped by the aftershocks of plague. Disease was believed to travel through corrupted air, foul smells, and moral impurity. Cleanliness was preventative magic. Order was protection, and Richard clung to both like talismans. But what begins as precaution can curdle into paranoia. Richard's court culture became brittle, overmanaged, fragile. When rebellion flared, he responded not with flexibility, but with theatrical assertion of authority. When nobles questioned him, he doubled down on ritual. When trust eroded, he retreated further into curated isolation. The king who washed himself in linen and scent could not tolerate the messiness of dissent. And dissent, as it turns out, does not care how clean your sheets are. By the 1390s, Richard's rule was faltering. His insistence on absolute authority, his favoritism, his heavy-handed justice, all collided with a nobility that had grown tired of being treated like dirty furniture in a room meant only for the king's reflection. The very hygiene rituals meant to elevate him now isolated him. Cleanliness became distance. Distance became resentment. When Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile and seized the throne, Richard's downfall was swift. Stripped of his crown, his regalia, and, most importantly, his curated environment, the king who had relied on controlled spaces suddenly found himself exposed. No layers of linen could insulate him from political reality now. His body, once obsessively managed, was reduced to a problem to be solved. And once again, history goes quiet on the specifics. We don't know what Richard smelled like in captivity. We don't know how often his clothes were changed. We don't know whether his attendants maintained his old standards or let them slip. What we do know is that his body ceased to matter as a symbol. And when a royal body stops symbolizing order, it becomes disposable. Richard II's hygiene story is not one of filth. It's one of overcorrection. Of a man who believed that if he polished himself enough, the cracks in the world would disappear. He believed that cleanliness, visual, ritual, symbolic, could substitute for trust. That the performance of order could replace the substance of leadership. It couldn't. And that's why textbooks struggle with Richard. Because his story forces an uncomfortable admission that hygiene, presentation, and bodily management have always been political tools. That clean has never been neutral. That sometimes the most dangerous rulers are not the ones covered in mud, but the ones who spend all their energy trying to wipe it away. If King John rotted quietly and Edward II unsettled through disorder, Richard II tried to disinfect reality itself, and failed. Because next comes a king who would wear illness openly on his skin. A king whose body would not be wrapped in linen or hidden behind ritual. A king whose physical decline became impossible to perfume away. And when a monarch's sickness becomes visible, cleanliness stops being a performance and starts becoming a problem. 4. Henry IV. If Richard II tried to rule by performance, Henry IV inherited the stage with the curtains half burned, the audience divided, and the main actor already halfway to exile. Henry didn't just take a crown, he took a throne still warm with usurpation. And when you seize power in a monarchy built on bloodlines and divine right, you better look the part, smell the part, live the part. But in Henry's case, he couldn't. Not convincingly, not consistently, and not cleanly. Henry IV's hygiene story is less about soap and more about skin. He ruled from 1399 to 1413, through rebellion, conspiracies, economic unrest, and the lingering stench of civil war. But what clung to him most acutely, perhaps literally, was his health. Unlike his predecessors, whose bodily uncleanness came from symbolism or sloppiness, Henry's was medical, chronic, visible, and despite the best efforts of his courtiers and chroniclers, his physical decline leaked through the cracks of royal ceremony like untreated damp behind a painted wall. This wasn't a reign that inspired many perfumed portraits. By the early 1400s, rumors about the king's illness had already begun to circulate. Some claimed he was leprous, which he almost certainly wasn't. Others described disfiguring skin conditions, fits of weakness, strange marks on his face, and unexplained pain. One chronicler even suggests his skin split open in patches, as if cracking under the weight of a body in revolt. These are not reliable medical reports. They're medieval impressions, filtered through limited knowledge and generous doses of superstition. But they tell us something crucial. People noticed his body, and not in a flattering way. In the carefully curated world of royal hygiene, that alone was a failure. Because kings weren't supposed to show deterioration. Their skin was supposed to glow with divine favor. Their bodies were supposed to absorb the burdens of the kingdom without ever displaying the cost. But Henry IV's skin, it seems, couldn't keep up the act. And once people start speculating about a king's lesions and discolorations, it's not long before they start speculating about his fitness to rule. So the royal household tried to compensate. Fresh linens, herbal compresses, special diets, maybe even attempts at mineral bathing, though full immersion was still medically suspect at the time. Cleanliness was a tool in the royal image kit, and Henry's attendants likely worked overtime to keep up appearances. But it wasn't enough. His illness kept escalating. There's no consensus about what exactly afflicted him. Some historians have floated ideas ranging from psoriasis to severe eczema to cardiovascular disease. Others suggest a form of disfiguring dermatitis or skin-related autoimmune condition. What we do know is that he suffered episodes of debilitation that affected both his appearance and his behavior. He withdrew from public events. He canceled meetings. He skipped ceremonial appearances without explanation. His health was no longer a footnote. It was the narrative. And in medieval politics, a king who disappears from view might as well be dead. This is where hygiene stops being a matter of bodily maintenance and becomes a matter of political survival. Because when your skin is inflamed and your joints ache and your strength falters, basic self-care becomes excruciating. Tasks that are invisible when done, dressing, washing, grooming, become monumental obstacles. And while kings were surrounded by attendants trained to handle such things, there's only so much linen and lavender can do when the problem lies in the flesh itself. Which brings us to the critical detail. How much of this was visible to his court? The answer seems to be too much. Reports of his condition weren't confined to private whispers. Chroniclers wrote about it. Foreign envoys noted it. Rumors reached the public, carrying the message that the king's body was, quite literally, failing to uphold its symbolic role. That he was less a vessel of divine right and more a leaking container of human frailty. But the worst wasn't the physical decline. It was the erosion of mystique. Because cleanliness in this era wasn't just about health. It was about distance. Kings weren't supposed to bleed or weep or scratch their inflamed skin in front of their courtiers. They weren't supposed to look like patients. And Henry IV, whether he wanted to or not, started looking more like a bedridden lord than a martial monarch. His condition blurred the line between the mortal and the sovereign, and that made people nervous. So nervous, in fact, that some began to see his illness as divine punishment. That's the medieval mind for you. When the king who deposed another starts to rot from the outside in, people look for cosmic meaning. Was God angry? Had the land rejected him? Was this payback for unseating Richard II, whose own obsession with bodily control now looked, in hindsight, like a desperate prelude? The stories wrote themselves. You didn't need propaganda. You just needed to watch the king scratch his face and wince under his crown. And here's the great irony. Henry IV was a capable ruler in many respects. He managed a deeply fractured kingdom through crises that might have sunk a healthier man. He navigated rebellion, dealt with overambitious nobles, and kept his son, the future Henry V, close enough to learn, but not close enough to stage a premature coup. But none of that stuck in the public memory. What did stick was the sense of a man rotting in office, slowly, visibly, tragically. That's why his hygiene, or rather, the failure of his physical presentation, mattered so much. Because once the king's body lost its shine, his authority followed. No amount of scented oils or ceremonial linens could reverse the impression of weakness. In a culture where washing was symbolic, Henry's body looked like a failed ritual. And maybe that's why textbooks avoid the details. Because it's not a heroic story. There's no triumphant campaign, no glorious death, no coronation drama. Just a man trying to hold power while his body slowly undermines him. Just a monarch whose skin told a different story than his proclamations. It's the kind of history that feels too physical for polite company, too human, too close. And yet, Henry IV's hygiene history reminds us of something uncomfortable. That power is always, eventually, a bodily thing. That all thrones are built on flesh. And that no crown can hide the cracks forever. Especially when the next king steps onto the battlefield with blood on his sword, dysentery in his ranks, and mud in every crevice of his war-hardened frame. Because next comes a king whose hygiene wasn't questioned in court. Because no one dared smell anything through the smoke of war. 5. Henry V. If his father's reign was a slow-motion collapse hidden beneath damp linens and inflamed skin, Henry V exploded onto the throne like a man who had no time for frailty, or bathing for that matter. The dirt clinging to his armor after the Battle of Agincourt wasn't just symbolic, it was biographical. Henry V didn't just march through mud, he ruled from it. And in doing so, he became England's great contradiction. A war god in human form, victorious and venerated, while smelling like a field hospital during monsoon season. He ruled from 1413 to 1422, 9 years of relentless campaigning, thinly disguised diplomacy, and all the splendor of medieval hygiene at its grimiest. But his legacy was too gilded, too militarized, to ever be told in terms of bodily maintenance. He was the king who won. The one who humbled the French, outmaneuvered the odds, and turned dysentery-riddled marches into national mythology. No one ever asked if he washed his hands. Because Henry V wasn't supposed to be clean. He was supposed to be hard. The kind of hard that doesn't flinch at battlefield amputations or weeks without a proper bed. The kind of king whose personal hygiene habits disappear into the fog of war. Not because they weren't there, but because no one dared to bring it up. You don't write about foot odor when you're chronicling a military miracle. And yet, the reality behind the legend is far more visceral. Henry's campaigns in France, especially the famous 1415 expedition that culminated in Agincourt, were logistical nightmares. The army suffered from poor sanitation, unclean water, and cramped camp conditions. Latrines were trenches. Water was often drawn from stagnant sources, and the risk of infection, parasites, and gastrointestinal illness was ever present. This wasn't unique to Henry's army. It was standard medieval warfare. But what makes it notable is how much of the king's body was subjected to the same harsh conditions as his men. Unlike some of his predecessors who withdrew behind palace walls, Henry lived the campaign. He slept rough. He endured supply shortages. He rode with his men, often in the same clothes for days. He was, in the most literal and olfactory sense, a king among soldiers. And while that lent him credibility and loyalty, it also meant he likely stank like the rest of them. There are no records of daily washing routines. No chronicler paused in the middle of praising his military tactics to describe whether he used rosewater or vinegar to clean his face. But we do know that illness stalked the army from the very beginning. Dysentery, known then as the bloody flux, was rampant. Soldiers died from contaminated water. Sanitation was barely managed, waste disposal was primitive, and the king himself was not immune. One of the lesser-known facts of the Agincourt campaign is that Henry may have contracted dysentery before the battle even began. Some historians argue that he was unwell during parts of the campaign, and that his health wavered in the miserable weeks leading up to the battle. Whether or not he was actively ill during the fighting, the point remains, he was operating in a disease-ridden environment where even the highest-ranking leaders shared in the bodily degradation of war. And this wasn't a short trip. Henry's army landed in France in August 1415. Agincourt took place in late October. That's over 2 months of campaigning across enemy territory in unpredictable weather with limited supplies. By the time they reached Agincourt, the English troops were exhausted, malnourished, and unwashed. Their boots were rotting from wet conditions. Their uniforms were stiff with sweat and mud. Their campsites stank of waste and illness. And Henry? He stood at the center of it. This is the hygiene paradox of Henry V. His greatness was inseparable from his grime. His legendary status came not from towering above the physical reality of war, but from sinking into it. The lack of washing, the endless exposure to filth, the shared suffering, these were not signs of failure in his reign. They were its foundation. But once again, that doesn't mean the king was somehow immune to the consequences. After the triumph of Agincourt, Henry continued his campaigns in France over several years, often under harsh conditions. And while he had access to better care than the average soldier, cleaner quarters, dedicated servants, fresh clothes when possible, he still lived the life of a commander in the field, which meant, inevitably, disease would catch up with him. In 1422, at the age of just 35, Henry V died during yet another French campaign. Official records say he died of dysentery. Others speculate on different illnesses, but dysentery is the most likely culprit, given the ongoing conditions of camp life and repeated exposure to contaminated water. He did not die in battle. He died, like so many of his men, in a haze of dehydration, fever, and collapse. And once again, we're faced with a royal body brought low not by politics or scandal or ceremonial failure, but by the most basic hygiene challenge of all, clean water and sanitation. But unlike his father, Henry's decline was sanitized in memory. The king who died of camp sickness was remembered as a god of war, not as a man whose bowels gave out in a field tent, because his myth could not accommodate the mundane. His legacy was forged in armor and script, not in the linens that were burned after his death. What does that say about how history treats hygiene? It tells us that when a king succeeds spectacularly, his dirt gets rebranded as grit. His stench becomes the musk of victory. His bodily weaknesses are written out or elevated into martyrdom. There is no hygiene scandal when the crown is carried home in triumph. There is only awe. But if you look closer, you can still see the truth. A king who ruled from within the filth. A monarch who slept in disease-breeding conditions. A body that could not outfight biology forever. And a reign whose legendary luster was built atop a layer of battlefield mud that never truly washed off. So no, Henry V wasn't remembered as unclean, but only because cleanliness had no place in his legend. And if his body was worn out by war, the next king's body was worn down by something far older and subtler, the slow, systematic management of royal space. A system in which hygiene wasn't improvised in a camp, but institutionalized behind palace doors. A court that didn't march, but sat, and sat, and sat, until the rituals of bodily maintenance began to look like the very foundation of monarchy itself. And when a king's bowel movements are managed by a salaried official with a Latin title, you know we've entered a new chapter in the royal hygiene story. 6. Henry VII. Henry VII was not the kind of monarch who liked mess, political, personal, or otherwise. He built his kingdom like he built his alliances, with precision, paranoia, and a ledger in one hand. The founder of the Tudor dynasty was a man obsessed with control, with legacy, and above all, with appearances. And while his court was quieter than his son's, less theatrical than Elizabeth's, and far less interested in ostentation, there was one area in which Henry VII set the tone for the next 100 years of monarchy: bodily management. Because Henry VII may not have had the flamboyant ulcers of his heir or the rigid ritual of the Stuarts, but he understood something that few monarchs before him had grasped quite so effectively. Hygiene was politics. Not soap and scrubbing in the modern sense, but the presentation of cleanliness, the impression of order, the choreography of bodily maintenance as a performance of legitimacy. This was a king who had clawed his way to the throne through civil war, one precarious battle and politically arranged marriage at a time. He had to appear more legitimate than the people whose bloodlines he had displaced. That meant more than just smart dynastic moves. It meant controlling the space around his body like it was a throne room unto itself. Enter the royal household. Under Henry VII, the English royal household underwent one of its most important institutional shifts, especially in the management of the king's private life. Historians often focus on the privy chamber, a small inner sanctum of the palace designed to house only the king's most trusted men, political allies, loyal gentry, and those deemed worthy enough to physically attend the monarch. But alongside the privy chamber, another lesser-known system took shape: the management of the king's bodily functions and daily routines. Which brings us, delicately, to the matter of the close stool. The close stool was, to put it plainly, the royal toilet. But calling it a toilet conjures too modern an image. This was a piece of furniture, a box with a padded seat, sometimes even velvet-covered. Inside, a chamber pot. Around it, ritual. Tending to this object was not a menial task. It was a court position, one held eventually by a groom of the stool. Yes, that was the actual title. And under Henry VII, the office began to grow in political importance. Not just because the groom assisted with toileting, but because he had unmediated access to the king's most vulnerable moments. He was responsible for the linens, the chamber pot, the privacy of the king's body. But he was also there to deliver messages, pass along information, and monitor the king's mood. In short, he was trusted, because in a world where poison, betrayal, and whispers could end a reign, the man who managed your bodily waste needed to be more reliable than the man who managed your treasury. And so, hygiene under Henry VII became bureaucratized. There are no surviving entries in the king's diary that say how often he bathed or how many times per week his undergarments were changed. But what we do have are court records, payrolls, inventories, service lists that show us just how much thought was put into the royal body. Towels, linen, perfumes, scented waters, herbs. These items weren't luxuries. They were tools of governance. They ensured that the king could present himself in public as controlled, dignified, and, above all, clean. Cleanliness here was moral, symbolic. It wasn't about avoiding germs, which wouldn't be understood for centuries, but about projecting a kind of bodily order that mirrored political stability. The king's sheets were pressed, his garments were aired, his privy was discreetly tended, his bedchamber was managed like a sacred space. And this was all done not because Henry VII was vain, but because he knew that perception ruled more effectively than fear. This is the quiet revolution of his reign. Not that he scrubbed himself more than his predecessors, but that he structured the mechanisms for others to do it for him. That he understood how bodies, when properly managed, became institutions, and institutions, when properly framed, became legacy. But here's where the contradiction slips in. For all this control, all this meticulous cleanliness by proxy, Henry VII himself was a man of declining health in later life. Records show he suffered from bouts of illness. He became more withdrawn. He increasingly isolated himself, physically and politically, from the broader court. Some biographers speculate that these health issues, perhaps a chronic condition or persistent pain, made him even more reliant on the carefully managed systems of bodily care that his household provided. In other words, even as his body weakened, the image of the king remained intact, because Henry had built a system that could maintain royal hygiene, even when the monarch himself could no longer embody it. The sheets stayed clean, the routine continued, the structure held, but the man at the center began to fade. This is the hidden tension at the heart of Henry VII's hygiene legacy. A king who believed in cleanliness, Not because he was particularly interested in comfort, but because he knew that monarchies rot from the inside out, when no one is watching. And so he watched, he monitored, he delegated. He created a court where even the most private aspects of the king's body were handled with institutional rigor. And in doing so, he left behind something odd, a royal hygiene system without a scandal. There are no juicy rumors about Henry VII's odor, no anecdotes about him avoiding soap or wearing the same underclothes for weeks. But that's precisely what makes him fascinating. His cleanliness wasn't mythologized or dramatized. It was made invisible, which, in Tudor England, was the ultimate sign of success. If no one talks about your body, it means you've managed it well. But if Henry VII was the architect of a royal hygiene machine, then his son was its demolition crew. Because next comes a king who could not be managed, a monarch whose body betrayed him spectacularly, publicly, and repeatedly. A man whose wounds, odors, and physical decline became the stuff of legend, so grotesque that even centuries later, textbooks flinch, and no amount of linen, lavender, or courtiers with titles could mask what came next. 7. Henry VIII. Henry VIII didn't enter history books so much as he smashed them with a turkey leg and demanded a portrait. He is one of the few English monarchs whose physicality remains instantly recognizable. Broad, red-faced, ornate, larger than life. An image so entrenched it's easy to forget that behind the Holbein swagger was a man, and behind the man was a body. And that body, for much of his reign, became a battlefield of its own. Not a battlefield of politics, that was par for the course, but of hygiene, or rather, the slow and public disintegration of it. To be clear, Henry VIII didn't begin as the stereotype. Early accounts describe him as strikingly handsome, athletic, magnetic. He was obsessed with sport, with pageantry, with the grand physical assertion of kingship. In his youth, he hunted, jousted, danced, and wrestled. All the elite entertainments that required a limber, well-kept body. And for the first decade or so of his reign, that's exactly what he had. The image was clean, composed, intoxicating. But the Tudor court was not a deodorized, antibacterial palace. It was scented, yes, but that was to cover up the things that couldn't be washed away. Cleanliness was not yet tied to sterility. To be clean in Henry's time meant smelling appropriate, looking orderly, and changing your linen frequently. Scented herbs, perfumes, and constant wardrobe maintenance were the scaffolding of royal hygiene. Baths were occasional and usually medicinal, not recreational. So long as you masked the mess, the assumption was that all was well. And then slowly, Henry's body stopped cooperating. It began with injuries. The king suffered multiple falls while jousting, high-impact accidents that would have caused significant damage in a time before X-rays or antibiotics. These wounds festered, reopened, and developed into chronic leg ulcers, particularly after a serious fall in 1536. These weren't just a nuisance, they were debilitating. They left him in constant pain, increasingly immobile, and, as court records and medical historians have since explored, frequently exuding unpleasant odors from the infected areas. Now, pause. This is where the stories start to take on a life of their own. There are accounts, largely retrospective, that describe the stench of Henry's ulcers, the difficulty of bandaging them, the lengths his physicians and attendants went to in order to clean, conceal, or manage the wounds. But many of these come from later biographers or moralizing retellings. The facts we can establish with reasonable certainty are these. He had ulcers. They drained. They required regular tending. And given the limitations of early 16th century medicine, they likely produced persistent odor and discomfort. What does that mean in a royal hygiene context? It means his body stopped being manageable. For someone like Henry, whose authority depended heavily on projection of strength, virility, grandeur, the breakdown of his physical body became more than a personal inconvenience. It became a political crisis. Here was a man whose very identity was wrapped up in motion, in dominance, in physical presence. And now he could barely walk without pain. Courtiers had to be careful with how they stood near him. Servants had to manage his bandages, his bedding, and the fine line between deference and disgust. This wasn't just a hygiene problem, it was a perception problem. Because once the royal body fails to uphold the myth, everyone notices. Henry tried to compensate. He became more controlling, more theatrical. His clothing grew even more elaborate. He hid the decline with volume, larger tunics, padded coats, mountains of fabric that disguised both his weight gain and the supports needed to help him move. His meals became more lavish, his court more rigidly ritualized. His presence was stage-managed to a degree that bordered on obsessive. Everything had to be in place because the king himself increasingly wasn't. But no amount of embroidery could erase the scent of a body in decline. The court developed routines to protect the king's dignity. Bedding was changed often. The groom of the stool, by now a powerful and discreet office, oversaw not only the king's toileting needs, but also the management of his intimate physical space. This was a role of immense trust, because managing Henry's hygiene meant navigating both his medical needs and his temperament, neither of which were known for stability. What's particularly telling is how few direct accounts of Henry's hygiene survive from contemporaries. His courtiers were, understandably, reluctant to put such details in writing. The job of the Tudor court was not to record the king's weaknesses. It was to erase them. This silence is its own kind of noise. But the evidence does peek through. We know that Henry kept apothecaries close, that he used herbal salves and medicated bandages, that his clothes were designed to accommodate his swelling limbs, and that the scenting of rooms became more pronounced as his condition worsened. We also know that the king became increasingly irritable and prone to lashing out, perhaps because of chronic pain, perhaps because of the psychological toll of watching his once imperial body slowly betray him. And yet, for all this, he was never labeled a filthy king. Why? Because he was still powerful. The myth of Henry VIII didn't collapse with his health. It ossified. He became the thunderous patriarch, the towering tyrant, the man who changed religion itself with a signature and a shrug. His physical reality, his ulcers, his weight, the likelihood that his breath and body were less than fragrant in his final years, were smoothed over by narrative. The same historians who recorded his 6 marriages and religious reforms often skipped over the linens soaked with medicinal salves. Because who wants to admit that the king who beheaded queens also needed help tying his garters? It's easier to remember him as the monarch of power and appetite than as the monarch of chronic pain and failing hygiene. But make no mistake, the court around him knew. The servants knew. The doctors knew, and the vast machinery of royal maintenance kept turning, an invisible labor force dedicated to hiding the bodily realities of a dying king. And this labor was intense. Imagine the effort required to manage a man who could no longer ride, who was too heavy to walk unaided, whose wounds required regular draining, and whose political volatility only increased with every setback. Cleanliness became a collective project. Not for health, germ theory was centuries away, but for symbolism, for dignity, for the illusion that the body of the king remained whole. That illusion held, just barely. When Henry died in 1547, it wasn't in disgrace. It was in ceremony. His legacy became law. His failures were softened. His body, however troubled, was given the royal treatment. Embalmed, enclosed, buried beneath brass and marble. Because what textbooks don't say is this: the crown doesn't cover the body, it distracts from it. And if Henry VIII's corpse could be perfumed into majesty, the next monarch would need no such help. She would reign not through body, but through will. A woman whose hygiene story was written not on the skin, but in the scripts of mythmakers. But even she couldn't escape the question of cleanliness. Because when you rule as a virgin queen, people start asking how clean the legend really is. 8. Mary. History has never been kind to Mary Wars. When it isn't calling her bloody, it's forgetting her entirely. Caught between a famously large father and a famously long-reigning sister, Mary is often reduced to a footnote wrapped in flames. But to study her closely, her body, her court, her physical life, is to encounter something far more unsettling than just the burnings. It's to see a sovereign whose hygiene was governed not by filth or slovenliness, but by illness. Quietly, persistently, and with devastating political effect. Mary ruled from 1553 to 1558, a brief 5-year reign that burned brightly and ended, like a candle left too close to a cracked window, in confusion, drafts, and silence. She was England's first queen regnant, not just a queen consort or shadow behind the throne, but a monarch in her own right. And yet, her rule was haunted by her body, its failures, its silences, and its refusal to comply with the expectations that centuries of patriarchal succession had placed upon it. We must begin, as her contemporaries did, with her health. Mary was not robust. From her earliest years, she was beset by recurring illness, headaches, stomach pain, irregular menstruation, fatigue. These weren't minor complaints. They shaped her behavior, her visibility at court, and her own self-perception. Throughout her life, letters from ambassadors and court observers speak of her recurring illnesses in the tone of diplomatic weather reports, something to track, to worry about, to politely misunderstand. And in the Tudor world, illness and hygiene were inseparable. When we talk about hygiene in Mary's case, we're not talking about grime or visible uncleanliness. Her court, like her father's before her, was structured around elaborate routines of bodily care. She had ladies-in-waiting to manage her wardrobe, laundresses for her linen, physicians to recommend infusions, and a chamber staff trained to maintain the scented, rigidly managed privacy of a royal bedchamber. Like all Tudor monarchs, Mary lived in a world of layers, of fabric, scent, and etiquette. But unlike Henry VIII, whose body eventually defied the courtier's best efforts to keep it ceremonial, Mary's body began, almost from the beginning, as a site of frustration. And it was never more visible than during the phantom pregnancies. In 1554, at the age of 38, Mary married Philip of Spain. The union was deeply political and deeply unpopular. But for Mary, it was also personal. She wanted an heir. She needed one, not just to secure her own legacy, but to preserve the Catholic restoration she had begun, a mission not just political, but spiritual. The Protestant Reformation had taken root under Edward VI. Mary was determined to uproot it. But faith, like dynasties, required bodies to carry it forward. So when her belly began to swell in 1555, the court rejoiced. The child, it was said, would be born in June. Plans were made, nurseries prepared, letters were drafted, and Mary waited, and waited, and waited. But the child never came. To modern eyes, it seems obvious. A false pregnancy. Possibly a psychological response to pressure, grief, and expectation. Possibly the symptom of a tumor or gynecological condition. Perhaps endometriosis. Perhaps something else. But in 1555, there were no such categories. There were only guesses, prayers, and court gossip. And this is where hygiene re-enters the picture, because managing a monarch's false pregnancy wasn't just a medical dilemma. It was a logistical one, a hygiene one. Linen had to be changed frequently, clothing adjusted, toileting attended to, herbal compresses administered. The Queen's body became a theater of speculation, every movement watched, every absence noted. How much discomfort did she endure in silence? How many days did she sit alone, surrounded by women tasked with comforting her, dressing her, cleaning her, while the kingdom outside waited for a baby that would not come? This is not the story of a dirty monarch. It's the story of a body that couldn't deliver, and the physical rituals designed to manage that failure. There are no salacious anecdotes about Mary's bathing habits, no apocryphal quotes about her stinking or refusing to change clothes. What we do have is the eerie silence that settled over the court in the wake of her false pregnancy and the increasingly whispered rumors about her health. Her complexion paled. Her appetite waned. She suffered from swelling, pain, and, eventually, another suspected pregnancy that also turned out to be false. By 1558, Mary was fading. Her health was failing in ways no one could explain. And once again, her hygiene had to be managed by others. Her final months were spent largely in bed, surrounded by a small circle of attendants, tasked with keeping her comfortable, clothed, and dignified. We don't know what specific conditions she had. Some biographers suggest uterine cancer, others speculate about kidney disease. What is clear is that her body declined quietly, without drama, and largely without the rituals of public mourning. Her death was not a spectacle, and neither was her hygiene. Because for all the drama associated with Mary's reign, the burnings, the Spanish marriage, the religious reversals, her physical presence remained understated. Her health was frail, but her dignity was carefully preserved. There were no visible wounds, no dripping ulcers, no festering rumors of rot. Just a body that didn't behave as a queen's body was supposed to. A body that never delivered an heir. A body that left no legacy. And that, perhaps, is why her hygiene doesn't make it into the textbooks. Because it wasn't scandalous. It was sad. And sadness doesn't sell. But it tells us something more profound about royal hygiene. That it's not always about dirt. Sometimes it's about silence. Sometimes it's about how much labor goes into maintaining appearances when everything underneath is quietly falling apart. And sometimes it's about the spaces history chooses to look away from. Not because they were grotesque, but because they were too intimate, too slow, too human. Mary, I didn't die in filth. She died in control. Or rather surrounded by people trying desperately to maintain that control for her. They managed her illness, her clothing, her privacy, and her legacy, right up to the moment she slipped away, unremembered in the hygiene myths of monarchy. But if her body ended as a quiet question, the next monarch turned that question into a theatrical answer. Because the woman who followed her would make cleanliness not a private matter, but a national metaphor. Even if, in reality, her own hygiene habits were far murkier than her legend lets on. 9. Elizabeth Verse, she bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not. That's the line. The myth, the punchline, the snide little footnote in every fun fact article about the Virgin Queen. The kind of anecdote that flutters across trivia pages, sandwiching her between garlic cures and medieval dentistry. And like most popular history, it's too good to be true, or rather too convenient. Because the real story of Elizabeth I's hygiene is far more intricate, far more calculated, and far more revealing than any calendar-based bathing schedule could suggest. To understand how Elizabeth Warren, Queen of England from 1558 to 1603, managed her body, you have to start with a contradiction. She was one of the most image-conscious monarchs in English history. During an era that had virtually no understanding of hygiene as we define it today. No germ theory, no understanding of bacteria, no indoor plumbing, no antibiotics. Cleanliness was not about sterilization, it was about optics, about scent, linen, fabric, performance, about managing the body as both object and symbol. And Elizabeth managed hers with the precision of a royal armorer maintaining a crown jewel. From the very beginning of her reign, Elizabeth understood that her body was no longer her own. It belonged to the nation. It was a political asset, a battlefield, a stage, and, most uncomfortably, a mystery everyone felt entitled to decode. Was she truly a virgin? Could she bear children? Was she even, in the suspicious murmurs of foreign courts, a woman at all. The scrutiny was constant. So she turned herself into an icon, a statue, a living emblem. And nothing ruins a living emblem faster than sweat. So how did she stay clean? The answer is, with layers. Layers of linen, changed frequently. Layers of cosmetics, applied heavily. Layers of ritual, etiquette, and distance. Elizabeth's cleanliness was constructed, not achieved. She wore it like she wore her gowns, strategically, symbolically, and with careful assistance from a small army of ladies-in-waiting and royal attendants. Let's begin with the linen. In early modern England, full-body bathing was rare and often discouraged. Immersing oneself in water was thought to unseal the body's defenses, letting illness creep in through the skin. But linen, crisp, white, absorbent linen, was a different story. Linen was the invisible machinery of hygiene. A fresh shift, undergarment, each day, or even several times a day, could absorb sweat and oils, drawing them away from the skin. Elizabeth reportedly changed her linen often, very often, enough to require significant laundering infrastructure in every palace she visited. And she visited many. Elizabeth's court was peripatetic, constantly moving from one estate to another, in part to avoid the stench and disease that accumulated in any one place over time. The smell of a static palace, filled with food waste, chamber pots, and perfumed bodies, was considered unhealthy. So they moved. Cleanliness by migration. In each location, her chambers were prepared meticulously. The queen's bedding, clothing, and personal items were attended by a close circle of trusted women, known as the gentlewomen of the privy chamber. These women managed everything from dressing to hair care to the maintenance of Elizabeth's vast wardrobe. Clean linen was paramount. So were scented materials, lavender, rose petals, orris root. Not because they killed germs, but because they maintained the illusion of purity. Next, the cosmetics. Elizabeth's face was as curated as a religious relic. Her infamous white makeup, often made of ceruse, a combination of white lead and vinegar, was applied thickly, creating a smooth porcelain-like effect. Beneath it, however, her skin likely suffered. Lead poisoning, skin irritation, and corrosion were common side effects of these cosmetics. And so more layers were applied. More powders, more rouge, more perfumes. A ritual of concealment. Was this clean? Not by modern standards, but to Elizabeth's courtiers it was divine. And this was no accident. Elizabeth deliberately cultivated an image of untouchable, godlike perfection. Her portraits show her suspended in eternal, fragrant youth. Her speeches speak of metaphorical bodies, not biological ones. She was England itself, unblemished, immortal, and odorless. But reality always peeks through. There are scattered contemporary accounts, some neutral, some hostile, that hint at the Queen's physical body being less immaculate than her legend. Reports from foreign diplomats occasionally note bad breath, yellowing teeth, or the laborious efforts of her ladies to maintain her hair and skin. But these remarks are inconsistent, often politically motivated, and rarely detailed. They tell us more about Elizabeth's ability to control access than about any objective hygiene truth. Because that's the central lesson of her bodily regime: control. Elizabeth didn't need to bathe daily to appear clean. She needed to appear in control of her body at all times. She achieved that through distance, carefully regulated proximity. Her attendants were trained to perform their tasks discreetly, reverently, without exposing the Queen to vulnerability. Her morning routines, known as the toilette, were partially public but tightly scripted. Everything was both ordinary and sacred. To touch the Queen was to risk misstep. And yet, for all this ritual, her body was not immune to breakdown. As she aged, Elizabeth's dental health declined. Her famously ornate diet, heavy on sugar, took its toll. There are whispers, some likely exaggerated, about missing or decayed teeth, about the efforts made to conceal the effects with closed lips, or strategic fan placement. Her hair thinned, Her skin became increasingly reliant on cosmetics, and her tolerance for elaborate dressing diminished. But still, the illusion endured. Because the queen knew what everyone else tried to forget, that royalty is a performance, and hygiene, in her court, was an extension of that performance. It wasn't about soap, it was about structure, fabric, discipline, silence. So what do we make of the once-a-month bath claim? Modern historians largely dismiss it as apocryphal. It likely originated from later writers, perhaps misunderstanding the difference between bathing and washing, or simply repeating folklore passed down through the centuries. The truth is, Elizabeth probably engaged in periodic partial bathing, washing her hands, feet, and face daily, with more extensive bathing on occasion, particularly when ill or instructed by her physicians. But that detail misses the point. The point is that Elizabeth's cleanliness wasn't measured by frequency. It was measured by effect. Did she appear unspoiled? Did her body symbolize divine order, political stability, and female chastity? Then she was clean. And that's why hygiene, under Elizabeth, wasn't about smell. It was about myth. She turned her body into a fortress, and her routines into ritual. She created an image so powerful that even centuries later, people still debate whether she bathed. That is control. That is legacy. That is what separates a monarch from the masses. And yet, her successor would inherit not just the crown, but the burden of that myth. A man who was supposed to represent union, rebirth, and Protestant triumph, only to find himself dogged by rumors of lice, filth, and royal stink. Because when you follow a queen who weaponized cleanliness, the slightest smell of disorder becomes a scandal. 10. James VI and I. There are few monarchs whose reputations have been reduced so neatly and so questionably to a punchline as James VI and I. He unified the crowns of Scotland and England, sponsored the King James Bible, survived the Gunpowder Plot, and reigned over the early golden age of Shakespearean drama. And yet, when his name comes up in popular culture, the conversation veers almost reflexively to the alleged lice. The rumor, the meme, the line you've heard before. James never bathed and left every room crawling with vermin. It's a catchy anecdote, easy to digest, and very likely false. But as with all good myths, there's a kernel of tension in the middle, a discomfort that makes the story stick. Not because James was a particularly unhygienic monarch, but because he was a monarch whose body refused to fit the mold of majesty. And in a court still haunted by the immaculate ghost of Elizabeth I, that failure wasn't just noted, it was weaponized. James VI of Scotland became James III of England in 1603, ushering in the Stuart dynasty and a whole new attitude toward monarchy. Less performative grace, more theological authority, more books, and yes, more flesh. Where Elizabeth had made herself an icon, James made himself a man, an anxious, bookish, wheezing, clever, profoundly human man. And in a political culture built on sacred images of power, that kind of humanity, especially when it sweats, stumbles, and scratches, can start to look dangerously like decay. So what was James actually like? He was described by contemporaries as pale, loose-jointed, and soft-bodied. He walked awkwardly, spoke with a pronounced Scottish accent, and had a fondness for long-winded theological debates. He was deeply devoted to hunting, to his favorites, most notably the Duke of Buckingham, and to the laborious art of avoiding assassination. His personal habits were idiosyncratic, but was he filthy? Here's where the evidence gets murky. The most widely repeated claims about James's hygiene stem from hostile foreign ambassadors and posthumous character assassinations. For example, a Venetian ambassador once wrote that James was too partial to his own opinions, careless in his attire, and neglectful of his person. Another report suggested that he frequently drooled and had difficulty controlling his bladder. Yet modern historians have consistently emphasized the political bias in these accounts. These weren't neutral observers. They were diplomats, often with agendas, writing from a mixture of cultural confusion and disdain. What's much more revealing is the contrast between myth and record. The English royal household under James retained much of the ritual infrastructure inherited from Elizabeth. His bedchambers were staffed, his linens were managed, his food was inspected. There were laundry accounts, records of soap, herbs, scented waters, everything that would suggest a functioning hygiene regime, appropriate to a court of the time. Servants continued the practice of airing rooms, rotating bedding, and managing waste disposal, just as they had done under the Tudors. There is no sudden drop in cleanliness policy that aligns with James's reign. So, where did the stink come from? From aesthetics, mostly. James wasn't elegant. His clothes often looked rumpled. He fidgeted. He slouched. He wasn't physically charismatic, and he didn't try to be. He didn't perform cleanliness the way Elizabeth had. He didn't wear the illusion of control in the same theatrical way. And in a court culture where bodily presentation still carried enormous symbolic weight, that lack of discipline was enough to spark suspicion. More importantly, James was Scottish. His habits, his food preferences, his accent, his court rituals felt foreign to the English elite. And in early modern England, foreign was often synonymous with unclean. His retinue brought different expectations around privacy, bathing, and ceremony. His male favorites, often accused of effeminacy or undue influence, became lightning rods for scandal. The court didn't smell worse under James. It just felt looser. And in a monarchy obsessed with surface, that looseness smelled like rot. The lice rumor likely stems from two intersecting ideas. First, the general association of unwashed bodies with parasites, not unreasonable in an era before frequent full-body bathing. And second, the suspicion that James's informal demeanor meant a lack of bodily maintenance. Combine that with hostile political cartoons, a few lines of satirical poetry, and some misquoted ambassadorial correspondence, and you get the enduring myth. James, I was filthy. Even today, modern myth-debunking historians, like the researchers at Fake History Hunter, point out that no contemporary English source confirms the lice story. There is no household record of infestations, no servant complaints, no physician's diary lamenting the king's refusal to wash. The story likely originated centuries later, repeated uncritically by biographers who confused gossip with documentation. And yet, it persists. Why? Because it's narratively satisfying. James, the awkward intellectual, the unglamorous successor to the glorified Elizabeth, of course he didn't bathe. It fits. It feels true. And in historical memory, feeling often trumps fact. But the deeper truth is more compelling. James VI and I was a monarch who failed to perform physical majesty, not because he was dirty, but because he didn't believe in the theater of cleanliness. He ruled with paper and ink, not powder and perfume. He relied on biblical authority, not visual spectacle. And in doing so, he created a gap between expectation and reality that writers and rivals were all too happy to fill with the scent of myth. That's the real lesson of James's hygiene reputation. Cleanliness was never about soap. It was about story. And James left the wrong kind. He gave his enemies too much material. The lurching gait, the drool, the limp handshake, these became metaphors. Markers of a king not quite in control of his own body. And in an age when the king was the body politic, that kind of failure didn't need lice to feel contagious. Still, to his credit, James understood at least one thing better than most of his critics. That legacy is written not just in how a monarch appears, but in how they govern. He may have left a less fragrant memory than Elizabeth, but he unified crowns, survived plots, and ruled for over 2 decades. No amount of embroidered gowns could guarantee that. But for his son, Charles I, the burden of that fractured image would be heavy. Because Charles wasn't just inheriting a throne, He was inheriting a body politic that no longer trusted its reflection. And in a world where even royal washing could be seen as political posturing, the next king would find himself face to face with something worse than rumors of lice. He would find out what happens when the ceremonial mask of order gets ripped off, and the whole country watches the dirt fall. 11. Charles I. The tragedy of Charles I is usually told in terms of politics and theology: divine right, civil war, Cromwell, the scaffold. But woven beneath the grand constitutional drama is a quieter, stranger story. One that takes place not in Parliament or on the battlefield, but in the king's private chambers. A story not of tyrannical declarations, but of silk shirts, scented gloves, and the slow, methodical construction of a body so rigidly clean, so obsessively presented, that when it finally fell, it shattered everything around it. Charles I ruled from 1625 until his execution in 1649. He is remembered, when he's remembered at all, as the monarch who pushed the divine right of kings too far, who misjudged his people, and who died a martyr to his own stubbornness. But what's often left out is how intensely he managed his own body, how deeply he believed that royal hygiene, the daily upkeep of royal skin, clothes, space, and scent, was not just a matter of courtly decorum, but of sacred duty. Because Charles didn't just think kingship came from God. He believed it had to look like it did. That belief began with his upbringing. As the second son of James I, Charles was not expected to inherit the throne. He was quiet, physically delicate, prone to a stammer, and often overshadowed by his older, more charismatic brother Henry. But when Henry died unexpectedly in 1612, Charles became heir. And with that shift came a transformation, both personal and performative. The boy who had once been shy, hesitant, and unassuming began to reshape himself. Into what? Into an icon. By the time he became king in 1625, Charles had cultivated an almost obsessive devotion to appearance. He was small and slight, but he dressed impeccably. His court was an exercise in elegance, controlled, understated, and precise. He favored meticulously tailored clothing, muted colors, and a refinement that bordered on austerity. Cleanliness wasn't flamboyant, it was serene, controlled, sacred. And sacred is the key word. For Charles, the body of the monarch was not just a political symbol, it was a divine vessel. He styled himself as the anointed king, chosen by God, ruling by providence. His body was not to be touched lightly, sullied, or exposed. It was a holy object, to be kept in perfect order. And so, the rituals of bodily care became rituals of theology. Each morning, Charles rose early. His bedchamber, like his father's before him, was staffed with a private team of attendants trained to manage the choreography of royal awakening. They brought warmed water in silver ewers. They presented freshly laundered linen. They helped him dress, scent his gloves, and prepare his person for public view. Every gesture was rehearsed. Every step was deliberate. Nothing was casual. The king's body was a sermon. Unlike his father, Charles didn't indulge in slouching or philosophical rambling. He didn't drool, lurch, or laugh too freely. He held himself with quiet precision, rarely raising his voice. Even his stammer, though present, was softened by his studied demeanor. The overall impression was one of stillness, restraint, purity. His court followed suit. The culture Charles cultivated was visually immaculate. Cleanliness, in the Jacobean sense, meant frequent changes of linen, fragrant air, polished surfaces. His clothes were cleaned and aired regularly. His gloves were perfumed with ambergris and civet. His skin was treated with herbal washes. He wasn't interested in flamboyance. He was interested in control. Because control for Charles was synonymous with authority, and authority in his view flowed from the body outward. But here's the paradox. The more he tried to perfect the image, the more distant he became from the world outside the palace. Charles reigned during a time of increasing political unrest. Parliament was growing restless. Puritanism was rising. The economy was strained. And in the midst of it all, the king floated, serene, scented, and unreachable. His court became a kind of greenhouse, beautiful, fragile, and sealed off from the stench of politics. He surrounded himself with like-minded aesthetes, devoted to art, ceremony, and protocol. He collected paintings, commissioned portraits, and embraced the visual language of divine monarchy. But outside the palace, the country was beginning to rot. Taxes were rising, religious tensions were flaring, and the king, immaculately dressed and aloof, seemed indifferent. Not corrupt exactly, not cruel, just removed, remote, almost antiseptic. To the Puritan critics of the time, his rituals looked not like piety, but vanity. His scented gloves, his polished shoes, his daily rituals of bodily maintenance, these were not signs of sanctity. They were signs of idolatry, and so the rumors began. Whispers that the king's body was not just clean, it was too clean, unnatural, feminine, even corrupt, that his fastidiousness was a mask for moral failure, that his obsession with order was hiding something rotten beneath. There's no real evidence that Charles was physically unclean. In fact, the opposite is true. He was probably one of the most bodily regimented monarchs England ever had. But in the court of public opinion, hygiene isn't about truth. It's about narrative. And the narrative was shifting. As the 1630s gave way to the chaos of the 1640s, Charles's bodily control began to look less like strength and more like fragility. The Civil War exposed the gap between court and country, between ritual and reality. The king who bathed in quietness and dressed in stillness now faced a world screaming for action. And his response? More ritual, more restraint, more silence. Even as his political position crumbled, Charles clung to his routines. He continued to dress carefully, to shave, to present himself in the image of a king untouched by crisis. And when he was captured, tried, and sentenced to death in 1649, he carried that control to the scaffold itself. On the morning of his execution, Charles dressed with particular care. He chose 2 shirts, fearing that the cold might make him shiver, and that the public would mistake his tremors for fear. He walked calmly, head high, gloves on. He spoke softly but clearly, and when the axe fell, it landed on a man whose body had remained, through triumph, failure, and disgrace, perfectly composed. But composition doesn't guarantee survival. Charles's obsession with hygiene, ritual, and personal order had become his political undoing. In trying to perfect his body, he had neglected the body politic. In cultivating stillness, he had lost the pulse of the people. And in managing his physical world so tightly, he left no room for the messiness of compromise. His death marked the temporary end of monarchy in England, and the temporary end of a certain kind of royal hygiene. Because when monarchy returned, it did so in a very different scent. Gone were the silent rituals. In came the perfumes, the wigs, the powders. A new king would take the throne, one less interested in sacred restraint and more interested in pleasure. In surface, in spectacle, in powdered wigs so clean they were rarely attached to real heads. Because next came a monarch whose court didn't smell like sanctity. It smelled like restoration. Chapter 12. Charles II. If Charles tried to preserve the monarchy through solemn ritual and self-contained cleanliness, his son Charles II brought it back with powder, perfume, and a thinly veiled smirk. The restoration of 1660 wasn't just a political moment, it was an aesthetic one, a sensual recalibration. The monarchy re-emerged from civil war and Puritan austerity like a man staggering out of a long, unwashed fast into a perfumed banquet. And the king who led this charge, Charles II, was more than happy to be its patron saint of scented decadence. Where his father had cultivated an image of divine restraint, Charles II ruled as if the body were not a sacred vessel, but a playground, a tool, a costume. And nowhere was that more apparent than in the hygiene habits of his court. Let's begin with the wig. Charles's reign coincided with the institutionalization of the wig as not just a fashion statement, but a hygiene strategy. In a period when lice infestations were common, shaving the head became an increasingly common solution among the upper classes, provided it was immediately covered with a carefully styled wig. Charles II, who began losing his hair early, embraced this trend with enthusiasm. His wigs were grand, voluminous, and elaborately scented. Made from human or horsehair, they were maintained by a new and surprisingly robust industry of wig makers, wig powderers, and wig servants. Powdering, it turns out, was about more than just style. Wig powder often contained starch, ground orris root, and perfumes like lavender or orange blossom. The goal wasn't just to look good, but to smell less bad. In an age when full-body bathing was still infrequent and scalp hygiene was a challenge, a well-powdered wig helped create the illusion of freshness. Charles's court was full of these illusions: the wigs, the lace cuffs, the cravats. Each layer was part of a carefully constructed hygienic armor, designed to mask the body's less presentable truths. Because make no mistake, underneath the powders and silks, Charles's hygiene was not what we'd call modern. He, like his contemporaries, likely bathed rarely. The concept of washing the full body with water was still viewed with suspicion by many physicians, who believed it could weaken the system, open the pores, or introduce disease. Instead, cleanliness was managed through dry methods: linen changes, scented balms, alcohol-based rubs, and perfumed accessories. The king's shirts were changed frequently, as were his stockings and underlayers. His hands were wiped, his face gently washed, his body perfumed. And yet, he was not considered a particularly clean man by moral standards. Not because he visibly reeked, but because his body was constantly on display, constantly entangled in narratives of indulgence. His court was filled with mistresses, his bedsheets with gossip. Where Elizabeth I had used her virginity as a cloak of political hygiene, Charles wore his appetites on his sleeve. Or rather, he wore them underneath the many sleeves he rarely seemed to keep on for long. And in a society still hungover from Puritanism, that level of bodily visibility felt dirty, even if it wasn't. The court of Charles II became notorious not because it smelled worse than anyone else's, but because it smelled like pleasure, like musk, like expensive oils and human closeness. His reign reintroduced luxury to the monarchy. Palaces were redecorated. Public ceremonies resumed. Scents wafted through court corridors, not always pleasant, but always intentional. The body, under Charles, wasn't something to be hidden away. It was part of the show. And yet, the illusion had its limits. There were moments when the royal performance faltered, and the realities of hygiene peeked through. Records show that Charles was prone to skin irritations. He suffered from episodes of ill health, digestive complaints, and persistent headaches. He relied on his physicians to prescribe tonics and ointments, many of which would now be considered dangerous or absurd. Mercury-laced salves, bleeding and purging. Herbal compounds intended to cleanse the body from within, often by aggressive external means, and the court around him mimicked the tension. On the surface, it was elegance incarnate. Underneath, it was a carefully balanced mess. Privy chambers were managed by teams of attendants responsible for laundering, airing, scenting, and disposing. Close stools, still the favored toileting method, were emptied discreetly, cleaned with vinegar or lye, and perfumed to disguise what could not be entirely banished. Palace corridors might be strewn with herbs or rushes to mask odors. Incense was burned. Rooms were ventilated when weather permitted. And still the scents of sweat, oil, perfume, and proximity lingered like a kind of royal musk. Charles himself was reportedly fond of strong smells. He was known to carry perfumed gloves, to gift scented items, and to maintain a wardrobe filled with fabrics infused with oils. These weren't frivolities, they were practical tools. In an era where odors signaled health, status, and moral order, a monarch had to smell like control. But there's only so much control to be had when your court is that crowded. The Restoration court was dense, social, performative. People lived in close proximity to one another, often for long periods of time. Personal space was limited, ventilation was poor, and as a result, the palace became a kind of scented pressure cooker, refined, ritualized, and slightly rancid underneath. Even the cleanest courtier would struggle to maintain freshness in such a world. And Charles, for all his performative hygiene, was no exception. His hygiene habits were well within the elite norms of his time. Frequent changes of clothing, extensive use of perfumes, management of body odor via herbal rubs and linen shifts. But his public image, hedonistic, sensual, physically indulgent, invited rumors, exaggeration, satire. To the Puritans, he was a walking symbol of moral and bodily decline. To later historians, he became the archetype of the decadent monarch, powdered on the outside, rotting within. And yet, he never apologized for it. That's the real legacy of Charles II's hygiene story. Not that he was unclean, but that he refused to pretend his body wasn't part of his reign. He made hygiene a performance, a scent trail of power and indulgence. He turned his personal habits into public expectation, and while it scandalized some, it also solidified his status. His body, unlike his father's, was not meant to be revered. It was meant to be seen. Which is perhaps why, when he died in 1685, suddenly, after an apoplectic fit, he left behind not a sacred corpse, but a performance unfinished. A body too mortal for sainthood, too physical for martyrdom, too scented for subtlety. And into that scented vacuum stepped a new monarch, his brother, who lacked both the flair and the theatricality. A king who clung to the rituals but never mastered the aroma. And in a court where smell was now part of sovereignty, that absence of scent would speak volumes. 13. James II. If Charles II scented his reign with musk, ambergris, and carefully powdered wigs, his brother James II ruled with the stark smell of discipline. Less playful, less perfumed, and, some might argue, less well-loved, James ascended the throne in 1685 into a court still perfumed with Restoration excess. But James was not a Restoration king. He was, in every sense, a man out of season. Where Charles had excelled at turning bodily indulgence into political performance, James treated the body like a tool of duty. Practical, controlled, stripped of frill. And in doing so, he walked the tightrope between royal decorum and personal austerity, never quite falling, but never quite dazzling either. Hygiene in James II's court was not a collapse nor a revolution. It was a continuation, an echo of the routines set in place by generations of monarchs before him, updated with the sensibilities of a man whose body, like his politics, refused to soften. And yet, it is this very refusal that makes James's hygiene story quietly fascinating. Because in a court built on spectacle, what does it mean to be clean but invisible? Let's start with what we know. James, like his brother, was raised in exile. During the English Civil War and interregnum, the young princes lived abroad in European courts, particularly in France, where the standards of courtly grooming were shifting dramatically. Louis XIV's Versailles was reshaping elite expectations around personal presentation. Wigs became elaborate. Perfumes multiplied. Bodies were no longer simply royal. They were curated, scented, and meticulously polished. James, however, absorbed this culture selectively. He wore the wigs, certainly. He maintained the necessary wardrobe, the daily rituals of dressing, the scented gloves, the powdered hair. He had servants to air his linens and manage his wardrobe. But compared to his brother, he was sober, functional, almost dour. His court lacked the effervescence of Charles's. His personal presence was less fragrant, more reserved. If Charles was the theater of monarchy, James was its rulebook. This, in itself, is a kind of hygiene. Not the hygiene of surface perfection, but the hygiene of control, of order, of personal discipline. James was a naval man, deeply interested in military matters, and it showed in how he carried himself. Even his approach to religion, he famously converted to Catholicism, was intensely bodily. Fasting, ceremony, penance, ritual. Cleanliness for James was not about looking good. It was about being right. But the problem with moral hygiene is that it doesn't always translate to popularity. James's court, though clean by contemporary standards, felt cold, less inviting, less human. Where his brother's court was known for banter and flirtation, James's was marked by distance. Even his intimate circle was smaller, more politically cautious. The routines of his bedchamber, while no less elaborate than those of his predecessors, lacked the myth-making flair. No witty mistresses, no scandalous liaisons, no scented legends, and that created a vacuum. In the absence of spectacle, people began to speculate about his body, about his habits, about his health. Satirists and pamphleteers, emboldened by rising anti-Catholic sentiment, began to fill that vacuum with rumor. One of the more enduring whispers was that James sweated excessively, that he had a sour scent, that he favored thick fabrics that trapped odor. None of this is supported by primary household records, but the gossip gained traction because it fit the narrative: a king out of step, out of touch, and out of favor. The hygiene critique, in other words, was a proxy. A way of saying, we don't like how he feels, so we'll say he smells. In truth, James had access to all the hygiene technologies of the era: servants trained in personal care, a court infrastructure designed to manage cleanliness, perfumed accessories, herbal washes, and a culture that expected him to change linen regularly and maintain a polished appearance. There's no documented evidence of neglect, no reports of actual filth, only the political stench of unpopularity. But perception is power. As tensions rose over religion, succession, and James's authoritarian tendencies, his personal image deteriorated. He may have been meticulously dressed, but he was also increasingly portrayed as foreign, decadent, even sinister. The rituals of Catholic worship, with their incense and ablutions, were painted by Protestant critics as suspect. Too much ceremony, too much scent, too much body. And yet, paradoxically, those same critics accused James of being too austere, too stern, too humorless. The body was always the battleground. If he was clean, he was cold. If he was warm, he was weak. If he showed restraint, he was accused of repression. If he showed indulgence, he was accused of corruption. There was no right amount of hygiene, only the wrong kind of presence. This tension would follow him all the way to the Glorious Revolution. By 1688, James had lost control of his image and his throne. William of Orange, his Protestant son-in-law, invaded England and was greeted not with resistance, but with quiet acceptance. James fled into exile, not because he was dirty, but because he was unreadable. His body never became myth. It never glowed. It never stank. It just failed to convince. And that's the strange, ironic end to James's hygiene story. For all his order, his structure, his physical maintenance, he left behind no smell at all. No legend, no scandal, just a gap in the narrative, quickly filled by the dazzling hygiene myth of what came next. Because Mary II, James's daughter, would co-reign with William, ushering in a new era of constitutional monarchy, Enlightenment ideals, and a shifting standard of bodily presence. And while her reign was brief, her relationship to hygiene would reflect something new, a court beginning to medicalize cleanliness, to moralize it, to secularize the rituals once soaked in incense and confession. But James? James's body disappears from the hygiene record like steam from a bath, because sometimes the cleanest kings leave the faintest traces. And yet, even the faintest trace matters, because the next monarch would reign in the shadow of illness, perfumed pillows, and whispered fear. And in her bedchamber, the scent of lavender would be less about pleasure than survival. 14. Mary II. If Charles II perfumed monarchy and James II purified it, Mary II inhaled the contradictions. Queen from 1689 to 1694 alongside her husband and cousin William III, Mary was a ruler caught between public duty and private frailty, between the increasingly rational rituals of Enlightenment England and the lingering bodily anxieties of a world still terrified of unseen poisons and divine punishments. Her reign, though short, offers a glimpse into a pivotal moment, when royal hygiene began to tiptoe from theatrical ritual into early medicalization. This was a queen whose body mattered not because it shocked, but because it vanished. Mary II was not a flamboyant ruler. She didn't carry the performative weight of Elizabeth I or the decadent shadow of Charles II. She was restrained, elegant, and famously domestic. And yet her body and how it was managed behind palace doors speaks volumes. Because in Mary's case, hygiene wasn't about indulgence or discipline. It was about fragility. Let's begin with context. Mary was born in 1662, raised in a court of rising sophistication. Her father, James II, had been steeped in both Catholic ritual and Restoration elegance. Her uncle, Charles II, had bathed in perfume and spectacle. But Mary's generation, reigning into the 1690s, was facing something new, the medicalization of bodily care. Disease was no longer just divine punishment or foul air. It was increasingly a problem of management, of fabrics, of airflow, of posture, diet, and ritual cleanliness. This shift mattered, especially for someone like Mary, whose health was quietly but consistently troubled. Records show that Mary suffered several prolonged illnesses throughout her life, culminating in the smallpox that killed her at age 32. But before that, she endured repeated fevers, fatigue, skin complaints, and various mysterious symptoms that biographers note with a respectful vagueness. The specifics don't survive in detail, but the court rituals that surrounded her tell us a great deal. Mary's body was tended to with meticulous care, her linen was changed regularly, and her apartments, especially her bedchambers, were aired, scented, and closely managed by her household staff. The Queen's rooms at Whitehall and Kensington Palace were designed to balance privacy with access. Only the most trusted attendants entered the intimate spaces of washing and dressing. Herbal sachets and perfumed gloves were still in vogue, but now they shared space with vinegar washes, spiced plasters, and what passed for medicinal tinctures. The personal hygiene of Mary II wasn't flashy, it was cautious. She avoided excessive immersion in water, as was common at the time, still considered risky, especially for women perceived as delicate. Instead, she practiced partial washing. The face, hands, and feet were cleaned regularly with cloth and scented waters. Lavender, rose, rosemary, and bay laurel were popular for their supposed health properties. She would have had access to warmed basins, gentle soaps, and freshly boiled cloths, all overseen by the women closest to her. But perhaps more than the materials, it's the tone of her hygiene rituals that matters. Mary's physical care was conducted with a quiet intensity, a sense of precaution, because her health was fragile, and because women, especially royal women, were expected to exist in a delicate state of moral and physical cleanliness. The Queen wasn't just to be clean, she was to seem perpetually vulnerable to being uncleaned by the world. And so, her cleanliness was not just bodily, it was symbolic. Her bedding was meticulously maintained. Her hair was managed daily, oiled and brushed and arranged with the same careful repetition as any Tudor predecessor, but now with the added overlay of health theory. Clean hair meant balanced humors. Airy rooms meant a calm temperament. Linen shifts, regularly changed, acted as both modesty screens and health technology, absorbent, breathable, and reassuring. But all this delicate care couldn't stop the decay creeping in. Mary's health began to falter more visibly in the early 1690s. She fell ill with fevers, weakness, and skin eruptions. And in December 1694, she developed a sudden, aggressive case of smallpox, still a common and deadly disease in England despite the growing use of variolation, an early form of inoculation. Her attendants, trained in discretion and dignity, tried to preserve her modesty and composure. Clean linens were changed constantly. The air was treated with vinegar and burning herbs. Visitors were limited. Curtains were drawn, but nothing helped. Mary deteriorated rapidly. She died on December 28, 1694. She was 32 years old, and here again hygiene intersects with myth, because her death was considered shocking not just for its speed but for its irony. Mary had lived a careful, clean life. She had followed the protocols, avoided excess, embraced modesty. Her body had been managed with precision. And yet, in the end, her skin betrayed her. Smallpox, cruelly indiscriminate, destroyed the very surface she had kept so dignified. This was not lost on her contemporaries. Pamphlets and sermons memorialized her godly cleanliness, her self-restraint, her composure. Writers described her body in glowing posthumous terms, still pure, morally hygienic. Her death became a kind of proof that virtue could not ward off disease, that even the most controlled, sweet-smelling, properly managed queen could be unmade in a week. And so, in her legacy, Mary's hygiene became her epitaph. Unlike Elizabeth, whose cleanliness was mythic and martial, or Charles II, whose hygiene was theatrical, Mary's was domestic, emotional, quietly tragic. The image of her in her sick room, still surrounded by scent sachets, her sheets fresh, her attendants whispering, lingers more vividly than any portrait. A body kept meticulously clean, undone by something far beyond soap and lavender. In many ways, her reign marked the end of an era. The 17th century had witnessed hygiene as courtly ritual, religious symbol, political performance. But Mary's death gestured toward something new. Hygiene as vulnerability, as a defense against invisible enemies, as a shield that might not hold. Her husband, William III, would continue to rule after her death, but with a somber pall over the court. The Queen's absence, and the helplessness of all the perfume protections that had surrounded her, left a lingering unease. If cleanliness couldn't save her, what could it do for anyone else? That question would haunt the next monarchs, because up next was a queen whose body was anything but quiet. A woman beset by illness so constant and visible that her hygiene routine became less a matter of polish than of pain management. A body that would require constant attention, constant tending, and a court increasingly caught between compassion and revulsion. Because when illness isn't occasional but chronic, it forces the entire concept of royal cleanliness to change. 15. Queen Anne. If Mary II's death marked the quiet failure of cleanliness to protect, then Queen Anne's life made it painfully clear that cleanliness had limits, and that sometimes the royal body wasn't a symbol of order, but a battleground of entropy. Anne reigned from 1702 to 1714, and for every year of her reign, her body was both physically present and politically precarious. Not because she was dirty, there are no scandalous hygiene stories smeared across the court logs, but because she was chronically ill, visibly, persistently, and unavoidably so. Where Mary II was remembered for fading gracefully, Anne ruled while actively breaking down. This was a queen whose health defined her monarchy, a woman whose body refused to cooperate with the requirements of majesty. And in that refusal, she forced her court, and her country, to confront the raw mechanics of royal maintenance. Cleanliness, in her case, was not a performance or even a choice. It was a necessity, carried out by others, structured by routine, and rarely discussed in public because the truth was simply too uncomfortable. Anne was plagued by illness from early adulthood, long before she inherited the crown. Historians have variously diagnosed her with gout, lupus, diabetes, or autoimmune disorders, but the reality is that we'll never know for sure. What we do know, because the records make it impossible to ignore, is that she suffered from swelling in her joints and limbs, severe pain, fatigue, and mobility issues that worsened as she aged. By the time she became queen in 1702, she was already partially disabled. By the end of her reign, she was effectively immobile, and yet she ruled. Which means that her hygiene, her bodily upkeep, was not merely symbolic. It was logistical, practical, and intimate in a way that few monarchs before her had ever made so plainly visible. Consider for a moment the mechanics of hygiene for a queen who could not easily walk, who suffered from inflamed limbs and required help to stand, to sit, to move, and to dress. This was not a world of ergonomic chairs and mobility aids. This was a world of stiff corsets, layered skirts, and beds that required effort to climb into. And Anne had to be moved, dressed, undressed, sponged, and redressed multiple times a day by attendants sworn to discretion, trained in ceremony, and caught between duty and compassion. There's a kind of silence in the records about what this looked like day to day, but the details peek through in the logistics. Anne required special wheelchairs, carved, padded, and fitted for her swollen body. She was carried between rooms on occasion. Her bedding had to be changed more frequently than usual, not due to any scandal, but because chronic illness often brings with it fever, night sweats, and incontinence. Her garments were tailored to accommodate inflammation. Her footwear, when she wore it, was wide, soft, and sometimes open. And through all of it, the queen remained a symbol of state, which is perhaps the most brutal part of the story. Because even as her joints flared and her weight increased, even as her skin blistered and her body failed her, Anne was expected to remain dignified. Her attendants changed her linen regularly. They aired her chambers. They rubbed her with oils and lotions meant to soothe and cleanse. They arranged her body into garments that made her look whole. They powdered her hair and perfumed her gloves. They managed the space around her so meticulously that the public could still believe the fiction, that their monarch was upright, composed, and in control. But Anne wasn't in control. Not of her body, not of her health, and not often of her emotions. Her reign was marked by intense interpersonal relationships, most famously with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, whose influence over Anne was both personal and political. Their correspondence is full of the language of intimacy, need, and fatigue, and Anne relied on her companions not just for emotional support, but for bodily assistance. Her ability to govern was increasingly tethered to her ability to physically function. And as her health declined, so did her court's ability to maintain the illusion of normalcy. There are no records accusing Queen Anne of being unclean, but there are absences, gaps in appearance, unexplained delays, increasing stretches of time when the Queen remained unseen. Behind those absences were bedsheets, compresses, and quietly exhausted women tasked with managing the unmanageable. Anne's body was not spectacularly grotesque. It was not scandalous. It was simply human, in a way monarchy had never wanted to admit. And that humanity was deeply unsettling, because Anne wasn't just sick. She was also grieving. 17 pregnancies. 17. And not one living heir. The repeated cycles of conception, miscarriage, stillbirth, and infant death took a brutal toll, not just on her health, but on her soul. And if the court was already managing her body, they now had to manage her grief. Her emotional state became yet another hygiene concern, something to soothe, control, and regulate. The language of the time often tiptoes around this. Courtiers refer to her distress, her melancholy, her delicate constitution, But what they're describing is a woman whose body had been through more than most could bear, and who now needed round-the-clock physical support just to get through the duties of a single day. And that care, the endless tending, became invisible by design. Because hygiene in Anne's court was no longer glamorous. It was burdensome. It was medical. It was deeply, intimately tied to pain. And no one wanted to see that. Not the public, not Parliament, not the next generation of royals looking for a model of sovereign strength. So when Anne died in 1714, bloated, bedridden, and broken down by decades of illness, she left behind no great hygiene scandal, no rot, no odor, no myth, just exhaustion. She was buried with dignity, mourned with the solemnity due a queen, and remembered, when she was remembered at all, as the last Stuart monarch. But the courtiers who had dressed her, bathed her, and lifted her from one chair to another day after day, they knew what the records do not say. They knew the weight of her body, the rawness of her skin, the smell of illness that no lavender could entirely mask. They knew that royalty is a construct, a carefully scented illusion, and they knew how much work it takes to keep that illusion intact when the monarch herself is too swollen to stand. Because the next king would be a foreigner. German, practical, distant. A man who didn't speak much English, didn't care for ceremony, and carried with him a very different standard of bodily presence. And when he arrived, monarchy itself would begin to shift, from sacred performance to bureaucratic function. But even then, the body of the king still had to smell like authority. 16. George verse. When George. I arrived in England in 1714, it wasn't with fanfare. It was with confusion, translators, and a deeply uncomfortable sense that the man now wearing the crown of Britain had no particular interest in performing Britishness, let alone royal glamour. Where his predecessors had projected their monarchies through myth, mistresses, martyrs, and majestic imagery, George I ruled with the understated flair of a man attending a board meeting he didn't schedule. He did not speak English fluently. He did not charm courtiers. He rarely smiled. And yet he became king, not through conquest or charisma, but through a legal technicality, a Protestant bloodline that made him, by the rules of the 1701 Act of Settlement, the least problematic option for succession, the Hanoverian Compromise. And with him came a new kind of monarchy, detached, practical, perfumed in habit, but not in passion. And George I's personal hygiene habits fit right into that pattern, not scandalous, not theatrical, not even particularly interesting, but quietly, bureaucratically maintained. Let's start with the basics. George. I was born in 1660 in Hanover, then part of the Holy Roman Empire. His upbringing was shaped more by German military precision than by English theatricality. He lived through war, dynastic tensions, and court politics, but little in his early biography suggests flamboyance. By the time he took the English throne at 54, he was already settled in his ways, stoic, conservative, uninterested in pomp. Which is to say, he was not going to be powdering his face or throwing masks at Whitehall. And yet, even this plain-spoken foreign king had to fit into the unspoken codes of royal hygiene. He inherited a palace infrastructure that demanded ritual cleanliness, not because the monarch necessarily valued it, but because the people around him did. His English courtiers, staff, and household expected the king's body to be managed with the same decorum as his politics. And so it was. The personal hygiene routines of George I, though largely undocumented in vivid detail, followed the typical pattern of early 18th century aristocratic care. His linens were changed frequently. His wigs, shorter, more conservative than the towering styles of his Restoration predecessors, were regularly powdered and maintained by skilled wig dressers. His rooms were scented with herbs and floral waters, especially in summer. Like his predecessors, he made use of partial washing, hands, face, and feet tended to daily, full immersion reserved for special occasions, if at all. Nothing here suggests indulgence. Nothing here suggests negligence. If Charles II's court had smelled like clove oil and scandal, George I's court smelled like starch and quiet competence. And perhaps that's why he left behind almost no personal hygiene rumors. Not because he was pristine, but because there was simply nothing to say. His aloofness contributed to this absence. George rarely allowed his private life to become part of public consciousness. He maintained separate courts in England and Hanover, frequently leaving London for months at a time. He surrounded himself with German advisors, retained many of his continental customs, and kept a notable physical distance from the English elite. Even his meals were served separately from the court banquet. He preferred solitude and routine. His body, in other words, was not available for myth-making, and in the royal ecosystem of the time, that was almost a hygiene strategy in itself. Keep the king at arm's length, and no one has to ask how often he bathes. But even this disinterest had consequences. Because monarchy is not just about authority, it's about presence. And George I, clean though he may have been, often seemed like a man missing from his own narrative. Courtiers found him dull. Parliament found him awkward. The public found him foreign. The rituals of cleanliness were performed, but they had no symbolic resonance, no scent of majesty. It's telling that the most enduring personal story about George I is not about his hygiene, but about his wife, Sophia Dorothea of Chelles, whom he imprisoned for alleged infidelity and kept exiled for decades. Their estrangement, while politically motivated, created a sense of coldness around George's personal life. He was not a warm figure, not scandalous, not affectionate, just quiet. And that quiet extended to his body. The best we can reconstruct from surviving household records is a man who followed routine. He woke early, dressed conservatively, avoided elaborate costumes, used scent sparingly, maintained a stable staff, allowed his personal physicians to oversee his health, which remained generally robust until his sudden death from a stroke in 1727. Even his death was tidy. He died while traveling back to Hanover, collapsing during the journey with little warning. There were no months of lingering decline, no ulcers or court-wide mourning rituals centered on managing a visibly decaying body. Just a quiet exit, an ending that matched the man. And yet, the absence of scandal does not mean the absence of meaning. George I's hygiene history matters because it reflects a shift in royal embodiment. In his reign, the monarch began to move from flesh to function. He was less a divine body and more a political mechanism. The court still laundered his linens and powdered his wigs, yes, but they did so out of duty, not reverence. This is the beginning of monarchy as administration, not mythology. And in that context, the royal body becomes something to be managed, not worshipped. George thought it wasn't clean to make a point. He was clean because it was expected, required, and, frankly, inevitable in a palace staffed by dozens of people trained to keep the furniture and the sovereign appropriately scented. But this transition is fragile, because while George I's detachment worked for a while, it could only carry the crown so far. His successor, George II, would inherit not just the throne, but the tension between visibility and hygiene, between the monarch as human and the monarch as symbol. And unlike his father, George II had a temper. He had opinions. He had a body that did not always play along with the desired image. He would fidget, he would sweat, he would glare, and in the tightly laundered world of 18th century monarchy, that was sometimes more disturbing than filth. Because the body of the king, even when powdered and perfumed, was never truly clean, only managed. 17. George II. If George III was the monarch's machine, a quiet, powdered automaton carried between Hanover and Westminster with minimal emotional leakage, then his son George II brought back something far more animated and problematic. Because George II didn't want to be a fixture, he wanted to be felt. not necessarily loved, but certainly noticed. And that, inevitably, meant his body, his posture, his voice, his habits, his presence, became impossible to ignore. And the thing about being noticed is, people begin to notice everything. George II ruled from 1727 to 1760, a time when the British monarchy was navigating the uneasy transition from mystical embodiment to constitutional formality. Parliament was growing stronger. Cabinets were forming. Prime ministers were beginning to act like actual heads of government. But none of that stopped George II from trying to assert himself the old-fashioned way. Through the sheer force of royal personality, he was famously irritable, famously impatient, and at times alarmingly sweaty. This is not to say George II was unclean in the sensational sense. There are no verified stories of rot or stench or decaying limbs. But his hygiene history is marked by something subtler: restlessness, discomfort, and the human inability to sit still under powdered wigs and expectations. Let's begin in the most appropriate place: the royal dressing room. Like all monarchs of his time, George II's hygiene routine was structured by ritual. He did not bathe in the modern sense. Full immersion in water was rare, often reserved for medical necessity. But he washed daily, hands, face, underarms, using scented cloths, floral waters, and herbal infusions prepared by attendants. His hair was powdered, his linen changed, his outer garments refreshed and precisely arranged. On the surface, the system worked. But George II didn't like sitting still for it. Contemporary accounts, including those from court chroniclers and ambassadors, often describe the king as fidgeting, pacing, snapping at attendants, or simply abandoning protocol altogether. He reportedly grew impatient with long dressing sessions, sometimes rushing the process or resisting the elaborate layers expected of a monarch. This wasn't laziness, it was temperament. George II had energy. He liked action. He was a soldier at heart, proud of having led troops into battle at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743, the last British monarch to do so. He saw physical vitality as moral virtue. He disdained what he saw as soft or effete behavior. He didn't want to be perfumed and polished. He wanted to move. And therein lies the problem. Because 18th century royal hygiene wasn't designed for motion. It was designed to freeze the monarch into a portrait, to starch the body into symbolism, to make the king smell like authority, to appear unwrinkled, unbothered, unblemished. But George II sweated. There are numerous reports, some polite, some less so, of the king's tendency to perspire heavily under pressure. One courtier described him as red-faced and perpetually dewed. During warm months, his stiff garments became visibly uncomfortable. His wig shifted, his temper rose, and his attempts to appear every inch the orderly monarch were often betrayed by the simple fact of being human in a wool suit. Even his famous outbursts, usually directed at ministers, musicians, or servants, had a bodily intensity to them. He didn't just scold, he stormed, he gestured, he physically moved. And then he would demand to be dressed again, composed again, perfumed again, and sent back into the theater of governance with all traces of sweat removed. It was exhausting. Not for him, necessarily, but for the people tasked with making his volatility look like dignity. His valet, barbers, tailors, and chamberlains had to adjust constantly. A royal garment would be prepared, only to be rejected at the last moment. Wigs had to be cleaned, more often than usual due to his perspiration. Linen stocks ran higher to accommodate midday changes. His attendants had to learn to respond not to routine but to mood. And even this would have passed quietly into the bureaucratic hum of monarchy, if George II hadn't also been unusually obsessed with time. He was a punctual man, almost to the point of parody. He expected others to match his precision. Ministers who arrived late, even by a few minutes, were met with open hostility. This obsession extended to his personal grooming. His dressing routine was timed. Meals were scheduled to the minute. If attendants were too slow with his cravat or gloves, he would explode in fury. Now imagine being a servant in that environment. You are responsible for keeping the king clean, scented, and ceremonially composed. But the king is sweating, fidgeting, and shouting. The linens must be fresh, the face powdered, the hair restored, and all of it must happen in 10 minutes or less, or you risk being publicly humiliated. That was hygiene at the court of George II. Not a failure of cleanliness, a failure of stillness. But for all the stress it caused, this hyperactive hygiene had one surprising benefit. It made George II seem more alive than his father ever did. His body might not have conformed neatly to the static rituals of kingship, but it mattered. People saw him move, saw him bristle, saw him sweat. And in an age when monarchy was becoming increasingly ceremonial and remote, that mattered. He may have been a difficult man, but he was undeniably present. And yet, for all this energy, George II's body did not age well. In later years, his health declined, slowly, then sharply. He suffered from bladder issues, gout, and suspected cardiac problems. His mobility decreased. His famous pacing became less frequent. The same body that had once defied the powdered stiffness of court life now began to require it. Servants returned to structure, to scheduled care, to adjusted garments and softened routines. George II no longer sweated through his wigs. He sat beneath them, quietly monitored. The rituals of hygiene, once resisted, became necessary scaffolding. When he died in 1760, it was sudden, a ruptured aortic aneurysm. He collapsed in his lavatory. The irony was not lost on later commentators. The king who hated to be kept waiting had died in the one room where time waits for no one. And so ended the reign of a monarch whose body never quite fit the role it was given. Too active for ceremony, too impatient for symbolism, too human to mythologize. But if George II embodied the tension between cleanliness and energy, his successor would embody something else entirely, the illusion of domestic perfection, a king whose body on the surface fit every expectation, clean, calm, dutiful, until, of course, the mind took over. 18. George III. By the time George III took the throne in 1760, royal hygiene had settled into a kind of quiet normalcy. Powdered wigs were still standard, linen shifts still laundered by armies of servants, and perfumed water still dabbed behind ears to assure ministers that all was as it should be beneath the robes. But something else had shifted, something not quite visible on the surface. Because while his grandfather, George II, had burst through the seams of ceremonial constraint, George III wore the monarchy like a tailored illusion. Neat, disciplined, almost aggressively respectable. He was nicknamed Farmer George, not because he smelled like livestock, but because he rejected the excesses of previous kings. He projected domestic virtue, clean living, orderly habits. He was a monarch who didn't sweat through his wigs or shout at valets over buttonholes. He was, by all appearances, tidy. But underneath the polished linen and moral routines was something far more unstable, something that hygiene could neither conceal nor fix. Because George III was not undone by filth. He was undone by the betrayal of his own body, or more specifically, the war between body and mind that unfolded slowly, then spectacularly, across his long and complicated reign. Let's begin where his reputation does, with the appearance of normalcy. George III was fastidious. Even as a young man, he was known for cleanliness, punctuality, and propriety. He bathed more often than was typical for his time, not daily, but more than the seasonal dips of earlier monarchs. He changed his linen frequently. He valued fresh air and well-aired chambers. He preferred simplicity in clothing and grooming, avoided flamboyance, and unlike his Hanoverian predecessors, spoke fluent English and sought to present himself as authentically British. This was a king who saw moral order and bodily order as twin ideals: clean mind, clean habits, clean governance. But reality, as always, had as other plans. The early years of George III's reign were relatively uneventful in the hygiene department. He married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, fathered a staggering 15 children, and styled himself as a model of domestic virtue. His court was known for its restraint. Gossip faded. Rituals of personal care remained consistent: washing with scented cloths, linen shifts twice daily, wigs powdered in moderation, and careful dental maintenance. He even employed a royal dentist, a sign of modernity at a time when most aristocrats were still grinning through decay. In short, his body was managed, not as spectacle, but as responsibility. But that makes what came next even more disorienting, because sometime in the mid-1780s, George III began to exhibit strange symptoms. At first, they were small: a tremor in the hand, a sudden burst of speech, difficulty sleeping. But they escalated. His conversations became erratic, his letters more verbose. He would speak for hours without pause. Then he would become withdrawn, and soon, more alarmingly, his bodily control began to slip. These episodes were deeply distressing to his court, not just because of the king's health, but because of what it meant for the rituals of monarchy. The king could not appear in public if his body was not behaving. His hygiene, once quiet and unobtrusive, became a political problem. When his mind unraveled, so did the clockwork of personal care. Attendants who once laid out his garments and towels found themselves managing a man who no longer adhered to routine. He might wake in the middle of the night and demand to be dressed. He might resist washing. He might, in a state of manic agitation, bathe excessively or obsessively rearrange objects in his chambers. He sometimes insisted he was perfectly well and refused care. Other times he submitted to it, only to break into uncontrollable speech mid-ritual. The body that had once been a model of order was now unpredictable, and that unpredictability was terrifying. Royal physicians tried to manage it with the limited tools available: dietary restrictions, bleeding, isolation, herbal treatments, and restraint. None of it worked. His attendants were instructed to maintain appearances, even as the king slipped further into episodes that modern historians often associate with bipolar disorder or porphyria, though neither diagnosis is fully settled. And here's where hygiene becomes not just a background detail, but a central metaphor. Because George III's cleanliness, once his shield, now became a liability. His refusal to be seen disheveled meant his staff had to work overtime to preserve appearances during episodes of confusion. His chamber linens were changed constantly, not because of filth, but because of anxiety. His garments were laid out and removed and laid out again depending on his mood. His personal hygiene became a barometer for his mental state. Was he washing, dressing properly, using his royal toilet? Or was he pacing, muttering, agitated and unreachable? The privacy of the royal body, once sacred, was now politically volatile. When Parliament debated the Regency Bill in 1788, they weren't just arguing over governance. They were arguing over whether the king's physical state disqualified him from rule. His hygiene, or lack thereof, was weaponized as evidence. Courtiers whispered about soiled sheets, interrupted meals, undignified babble. Not to scandalize, but to confirm what they feared, that the monarch's body was no longer symbol, but symptom. And yet somehow he recovered. Or rather, he appeared to recover. He resumed public duties, returned to court life, resumed the carefully managed routines of washing, dressing, greeting. For a time, his hygiene, and by extension his sovereignty, was restored. But the cracks never fully closed. In his later years, George III suffered multiple relapses, each more severe. By 1810, he was functionally blind, intermittently lucid, and placed under permanent care. His son, the future George IV, ruled as Prince Regent. The old king, once so proud of his bodily self-control, now lived largely in isolation, managed by doctors and servants who maintained his hygiene in silence. And so he faded, not in filth or disgrace, but in quiet contradiction. Because even in his decline, George III's body was maintained with the utmost care. His attendants never abandoned the rituals. His hair was trimmed, his garments freshened, his rooms aired, his sheets laundered. The machinery of monarchy, trained to preserve the illusion of control, kept working long after control had vanished. That, in the end, may be the most haunting truth about George III. He was a king whose body obeyed him for decades, who kept himself clean, composed, and precisely measured, who tried, more than most, to embody virtue through habit. And yet, the same body that he disciplined so rigorously betrayed him from within, not through filth, but through chaos. Not through spectacle, but through a slow, quiet descent into incoherence. He died in 1820, blind, deaf, and alone in Windsor Castle. His funeral was dignified, his rooms were cleaned, his reputation, ironically, rehabilitated by the very order he could no longer maintain. Because if George II sweated through his monarchy, George III watched his self dissolve inside his own skin. A body kept clean on the outside, while the inside unraveled beyond the reach of all his careful habits. And his son, the one who replaced him, was nothing like him. Where George III stood for restraint, duty, and plain virtue, George IV would explode into view with every powdered excess his father had shunned. Because if George III's hygiene was a form of control, his son's hygiene would be a form of damage control. 19. George IV. It is no small irony that George IV, born into a palace managed by servants trained in the rituals of cleanliness, would go on to become one of the most famously over-laundered and yet persistently odor-shadowed monarchs in British history. If George III was the monarch of moral restraint and hygienic order, George IV, his son, was the king of spectacle, excess, and slow bodily collapse beneath layers of lavender and illusion. He reigned officially from 1820 to 1830, but for nearly a decade before that, he served as Prince Regent, a kind of king-in-waiting, while his father succumbed to illness. During those years, and especially afterward, George IV made a name for himself as a patron of the arts, a builder of palaces, a connoisseur of all things fashionable, and quite notably as a man whose body was under siege from the very lifestyle he championed. To understand George IV's hygiene, you must first understand what hygiene meant in the early 19th century. The Regency and early Victorian periods were marked by major advances in public health infrastructure, sewers, piped water, soap manufacturing, but not necessarily in daily personal hygiene. Full-body bathing was still not the norm for most Britons, even aristocrats. Cleanliness was more about linen changes, scented oils, grooming, oral care, as best they understood it, and public presentation. And George IV understood public presentation. At least he understood the idea of it. He just didn't always have the physical capacity to live up to it. Because behind the crisp collars and artfully arranged curls was a body falling steadily apart. Let's begin with the numbers, not because they matter in themselves, but because the scale of excess matters when we talk about personal maintenance. At his heaviest, George IV was estimated to weigh well over 250 pounds, by some later accounts, closer to 300. He suffered from what his doctors referred to as dropsy, now understood as edema, or fluid retention, along with gout, heart issues, and a host of gastrointestinal problems. His legs swelled, his joints ached, his mobility became severely limited, and with that limitation came dependence on valets, on attendants, on elaborate rituals to manage the illusion that he remained in control of his body. And those rituals became exhaustive. George IV reportedly changed his shirt multiple times a day, not just for fashion, but to manage perspiration and scent. He was known to bathe more frequently than his contemporaries, particularly in his younger years. But by the latter half of his life, full immersion was rare and difficult. Washing became the work of attendants. Warm cloths applied in stages, fragrant waters dabbed and massaged across a body that no longer moved gracefully. His wardrobe alone required a miniature industry. Each morning, a team of valets and dressers would coordinate the day's outfits, not just the coat and trousers, but the layers. Beneath, linen undershirts, waistcoats, braces, silk stockings, and a variety of accessories, all of which needed to be pressed, scented, and refreshed constantly. His boots were polished even if he wouldn't walk far in them. His gloves were perfumed even when his hands remained still. Cleanliness in George IV's world was no longer about health. It was about the concealment of decline, and nothing concealed decline better than scent. He was known to use large quantities of cologne and scented oils. Lavender, orange blossom, rose water. His presence was marked by a trail of floral fragrance, not because he was dainty or effeminate, though critics accused him of both, but because he had to be masked. The effort to stay perfumed wasn't vanity. It was necessity. His ailments, including chronic digestive problems, led to a body that was difficult to manage and even harder to ignore. Now, to be clear, we're not talking about some putrefying monarch waddling through palaces, dripping with unwashed filth. That's the tabloid version. The truth is more tragic. George IV likely had a more elaborate personal hygiene routine than many of his predecessors, but his health made the results inconsistent. There were days when he looked immaculate, days when he reeked of cologne and barely moved, days when he appeared in public looking ghost pale, drenched in sweat, with eyes glazed by painkillers, and days when he simply didn't appear at all. And through it all, his staff carried on the routine, pressing, washing, scenting, arranging, concealing. The layers of fabric, powder, and cologne became not just armor, but camouflage. The king was not so much dressing himself as being curated. And yet, he was not without self-awareness. Private letters suggest George IV knew how far his body had drifted from the ideal he once projected. He'd once been called handsome. He remembered it. He mourned it. And in some ways, he tried to cling to it, ordering ever more, tailored garments, applying ever more cologne, and demanding mirrors be angled just so to flatter the view. It wasn't denial. It was something closer to desperation. A man trying to preserve a vanishing outline. What makes George IV fascinating in this context is how public the private became. Courtiers gossiped. Parliament grumbled. Pamphlets circulated mocking his weight, his vanity, his perfumes. One particularly vicious cartoonist drew him as a bloated dandy drowning in his own scented oils. And yet, in an odd way, this only cemented the association. The king who stank of roses and decay at the same time. He was mocked for his elaborate breakfasts, for his private chambers filled with lotions and mirrors, for the excessive budgets his valets consumed. But he wasn't filthy. He was, in fact, overcleaned, polished to the point of parody. The more his body betrayed him, the more aggressive the routines became. The more he sweated, the more linen he changed. The more he ached, the more oils were applied. The more his joints refused to cooperate, the more attendants were brought in to prop, lift, and maneuver him through the daily performance of majesty. His death in 1830, after a decade of visible decline, was quiet but unsurprising. Heart failure, officially. By that point, he had become reclusive. His appearances were rare, his public image blurred into caricature. But behind the closed doors of his royal apartments, the machines of maintenance never stopped. His body, however swollen and battered, was still dressed, washed, perfumed, and staged. Even in death, he was laid out in crisp linen, powdered and scented, not because it mattered, but because it had to be done. Because monarchy, by then, had become a kind of living museum. The body of the king was an exhibit. It needed to look right, smell right, feel right, even if the man inside it no longer recognized the reflection. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling detail in all of George IV's hygiene history. That cleanliness for him became a form of disappearance. He was so rigorously managed, so obsessively maintained, that the person beneath the rituals became an afterthought. The real man, hurting, limping, sweating, reaching for yet another scented glove, was slowly erased by his own performance. And then came his brother. A man with none of the vanity, none of the perfumes, none of the illusions. Where George IV was powder and mirrors, William IV would be something else entirely. Coarse, impatient, stubborn, and, in his own way, maybe the most physically honest king of the entire 19th century. 20. William IV. If George IV was a royal opera, full of powdered faces, scent-drenched performances, and tragic excess, then William IV was more like a half-finished pub ballad, sung a bit off-key, half out of order, but entirely convinced of its own tune. Where his brother had ruled through velvet and varnish, William stomped in with muddy boots and no time for costume changes. He was famously brusque, gleefully unfiltered, and functioned less like a king and more like a ship's captain who'd been tricked into wearing a crown. Which, in some ways, he had been. William never expected to rule. He was the third son of George III, and for most of his life, he played the role of spare, not heir. He joined the Royal Navy at 13, served at sea for years, and emerged with the kind of swaggering energy that rubbed court etiquette the wrong way. He didn't love wigs. He hated frills. And he treated the monarchy as something to be endured rather than revered, which brings us to his hygiene, or, more precisely, his relationship with the performance of hygiene. It's not that William IV was unhygienic in the dramatic, shocking sense. There are no household accounts of rotting teeth or attendants fainting from odor, but there is a persistent pattern in the record of a man who simply did not care whether the rituals of royal cleanliness were performed to anyone else's standards but his own. He did not live to offend, but he certainly didn't live to impress. Let's start at sea. William's formative years in the Navy gave him a deeply practical approach to bodily care. Sailors of his era were expected to wash when possible, manage lice when necessary, and generally survive without complaint. Cleanliness was secondary to function. You scrubbed your body if you could, not because it was symbolic, but because it made work tolerable. That baseline of nautical pragmatism never left him. As Duke of Clarence, William kept a house that was, by royal standards, sloppy. He had a long-term relationship with the actress Dorothea Jordan, with whom he had 10 children. Their household, while affectionate, was noted for its casualness. Visitors commented on untidiness, the smell of wet dogs, and a general lack of polish. This wasn't scandalous exactly. It was just not regal. William didn't care. His linen was clean enough. His hair was combed enough. The dogs were friendly. He preferred comfort over ceremony, and that carried straight into his unexpected kingship in 1830. As monarch, William IV retained the same preferences. He reduced the number of court balls and was known to complain about the pomp of royal dress. He dismissed ceremonial routines as nonsense, and frequently shortened or skipped them. His grooming remained nautical, neat, plain, and unbothered. He kept his hair cropped close, no wigs or powdered queues. He wore simple garments compared to the sartorial dramatics of his brother. This was not so much a rejection of hygiene as it was a refusal to let cleanliness become theater. Where George IV had valets delicately arranging scented gloves and managing layers of lace, William preferred to dress himself. He bathed with more regularity than many assumed. Naval habits die hard. But there was no effort to perfume, no interest in scented oils or layered garments. He washed because it was practical, not performative. He changed his linen often, but never to impress anyone. The standard was functionality, not illusion. This stripped-down royal style earned him the nickname the Sailor King. And while it was meant as a compliment, it also revealed how jarring his presence was in court settings. He spoke too plainly, laughed too loudly, and smelled too Normal. No hint of rosewater. No layers of lavender. Just a man who had washed enough to feel comfortable and moved on. And yet, William's hygiene habits weren't completely outside court norms. They simply didn't match them. His royal apartments, for example, were functional but not elegant. Letters from foreign dignitaries describe rooms that felt lived in, not curated. There were complaints about open windows, drafts, the occasional dampness. One account noted that the king preferred to leave doors ajar and resisted the use of incense or perfumed air fresheners, which were still common in elite households to manage odor. His attitude was, if it's clean, it doesn't need to smell like a florist's stall. He was also suspicious of overly medicalized hygiene. Doctors at the time were beginning to push for more routine bathing and more complex theories about bodily balance, but William viewed most of this as fuss. He trusted his own constitution. He wasn't reckless. He took advice when he felt unwell, but he had no patience for elaborate preventative routines. To him, the best hygiene was eating well, sleeping properly, and washing as needed. But here's the twist. His body aged better than expected. Unlike his brother George IV, who spent his final years battling obesity and circulatory problems, William remained relatively active into old age. He outlived expectations, both politically and physically. And part of that may have been due to his moderate lifestyle. He did not overindulge. He did not suffocate beneath brocade. He did not perfume his skin to hide deeper decline. He simply lived in the body he had, and kept it in good enough working order to carry him through a reign that lasted 7 years. And yet, because there's always a yet, this honesty came at a cost. Because monarchy, by the 1830s, was still built on illusion. The king was not supposed to just be clean. He was supposed to radiate order, to smell like certainty, to glide through halls as if carried by ceremony itself. William didn't radiate anything. He walked in squeaky boots. He scratched his neck during meetings. He interrupted ministers to ask for tea. He sat with his legs apart and gestured wildly when excited. His hygiene wasn't scandalous. It was too normal. And that unnerved people. There's a kind of reverse filth at work in William IV's reign. Not the literal dirt of neglect, but the symbolic discomfort of a monarch who refused to polish himself into abstraction. He kept himself clean, yes, but not mythically clean, not iconically clean. He didn't smell like empire. He smelled like a man who had just come in from a walk, and that was the problem. Because even as Britain hurtled toward industrial modernity, monarchy still lived in a kind of scented dream space, and William IV refused to dream along. He scrubbed when needed, trimmed his nails, combed his hair, and expected the world to take him as he was. But monarchy doesn't work like that. It demands illusion. And so, when he died in 1837, quietly without drama, he left behind a legacy that was easy to forget. No scandals, no rot, no myths. Just a man who washed his hands, wiped his boots, and happened to be king. His niece, however, would not make the same mistake. Where William IV dismissed spectacle, Queen Victoria would embrace it. She would perfume monarchy with morality, ceremony, and visual splendor. She would turn bodily control into national identity, and in doing so, she would elevate hygiene from private habit to imperial metaphor. Because the next royal body wasn't just clean, it was meant to be pure. 21. Queen Victoria. For a queen whose reign defined an entire era, Queen Victoria's body rarely takes center stage. She is remembered as a moral symbol, a figurehead of empire, an icon of duty wrapped in widow's black. She was the ultimate institutional monarch, anchored in respectability, shaped by family, framed in lace, marble, and portraiture. But behind the sovereign's image was something else. A woman whose bodily reality was constantly stage-managed, concealed, and occasionally betrayed by the very hygiene culture she helped shape. Queen Victoria reigned from 1837 to 1901, a 63-year stretch that spanned the explosive transformation of British public health, technology, and domestic life. This was the age of indoor plumbing, antiseptic surgery, soap advertising, germ theory, and the birth of the modern bathroom. Cleanliness went from being a private virtue to a national obsession, and Victoria's body became its living mascot. But here's the contradiction. While she stood as the matronly embodiment of moral purity, the practical reality of her own hygiene was far more complicated, because even queens don't escape the limitations of their era, especially when it comes to plumbing, privacy, and childbirth. Victoria was not raised in opulence. Her childhood at Kensington Palace was notoriously strict, micromanaged by her mother and Sir John Conroy, under what historians now refer to as the Kensington system. Even her hygiene was regimented: cold baths, linen routines, tightly structured grooming. Cleanliness was framed not as comfort, but as moral discipline. Water was for fortitude, not pleasure. So it's not surprising that Victoria brought this same sensibility into her adult life. As queen, she adopted regular bathing, partial washing daily, full immersion baths weekly or bi-weekly, depending on the period of her life and health. She valued cleanliness, not as luxury, but as propriety. Morning routines included warm water washes with cloths infused with lavender or rose oils, fresh linens, and brushed hair. Her staff was trained in silence, efficiency, and discretion. But the deeper truth is this: hygiene for Victoria was not about being clean. It was about being seen to be clean, and that pressure intensified dramatically with her marriage to Prince Albert. Albert, a German prince and reform-minded intellectual, brought with him a progressive, some might say obsessive, interest in sanitation, order, and domestic improvement. He championed plumbing upgrades at Buckingham Palace, advocated for clean water access in the city, and personally oversaw the redesign of royal residences to include better waste disposal systems. He believed in the gospel of cleanliness, both public and private. Victoria, ever conscious of image, adapted. The royal apartments were modernized. Bathrooms were installed with flushing toilets and bathtubs, albeit slowly and unevenly. Grooming routines became more structured. Toothbrushes, soap, and combs were kept meticulously arranged. The Queen was known to use Bailey's tooth powder and imported soaps. Hair was brushed in long strokes each evening. Nightgowns and linens were changed frequently. Her maids followed a tight routine of cleaning, folding, perfuming, and discreet disposal. But none of this removed the awkwardness of bodily management, especially in a time when women's health was shrouded in euphemism. Victoria gave birth to 9 children between 1840 and 1857. Each pregnancy disrupted her hygiene routine, not just physically but culturally. Discussions of childbirth were avoided in public. Biographers wrote around it even in the decades following her reign. But her personal letters, often hilariously candid, tell another story. She complained about postnatal discomfort, about the weight gain, about the constant interference of nurses and doctors who insisted on fussing over her body when she just wanted peace. Pain management was limited. Sanitation during childbirth was still rudimentary. Linen changes were constant. Scented cloths were used to cover smells. Royal laundries worked overtime. And yet, all of it was supposed to be invisible. The Queen's image remained one of dignified maternity, even as her attendants scrubbed floors and replaced stained sheets behind the scenes. And then came widowhood. When Albert died in 1861, Victoria plunged into mourning, emotionally, politically, and physically. She wore black for the rest of her life, a decision that turned her body into a permanent symbol of grief. Her hygiene routines became more secluded. She withdrew from public life, spending long stretches at Balmoral and Osborne House, where the pace was slower and the air, she believed, cleaner. But her personal care did not stop. In fact, her isolation made hygiene even more ritualized. Servants were carefully vetted for discretion. Her bathwater was tested for temperature and purity. She still bathed regularly, though never daily. She wore clean linen and perfumed her gloves. Her chamber pots were emptied by hand, even in the age of plumbing, because the Queen did not trust mechanical systems. and her household continued to operate on an elaborate, invisible timetable of bodily maintenance. She even had her own brand of soap. Literally, Victoria's hygiene became a matter of national symbolism. She was sold to the public as the paragon of domestic cleanliness. Her habits, though mundane, were mythologized. That she brushed her hair nightly became a lesson in virtue. That she disliked smoking became a model for moral restraint. She was no longer just clean. She was cleanliness personified. But behind the myth, the aging queen struggled. Victoria's later years were marked by mobility issues, digestion problems, and the general wear of age. She gained weight. Her knees ached, her eyesight declined, and yet the maintenance continued. Maids helped her bathe. Physicians oversaw her diet. Her underclothes were changed multiple times a day, particularly during travel. Her rooms were kept airy, her bedding always fresh. She never appeared disheveled in public, even as her body creaked and resisted. And that's the deeper irony of Queen Victoria's hygiene legacy. She did everything right, and yet her body still aged, still betrayed her, still required care that could not be glamorized. Because cleanliness was not control. It was pretense. Her death in 1901 was peaceful, heavily ritualized, and hygienically managed to the last detail. Her body was washed by her most trusted attendants. Her hair was brushed. Her face was arranged. And then she was placed in her coffin with all the decorum and lavender scent of a woman who had spent her life convincing the world that bodily maintenance was the same thing as moral greatness. But it wasn't. It never had been. The empire she ruled was full of contradictions. Millions of people without clean water, cities with open sewers, tenement houses bursting with filth, all under the reign of a monarch whose bathroom was scrubbed daily. And that, in the end, is the most Victorian legacy of all, a world where hygiene became a symbol, not a solution. Queen Victoria was never dirty, but she wasn't untouched by dirt either. She just had enough servants and enough myths to carry it away before anyone noticed. But her son, the next king, he didn't just flirt with dirt. He smoked it, chewed it, wore it on his gums. Because Edward VII would drag the whole idea of royal hygiene back into the open. And he'd do it with a cigar in his mouth and a toothbrush nowhere in sight. 22. Edward VII. If Queen Victoria was the monument, Edward VII was the man who kicked off his boots at the base of it and lit a cigar. He was not born to rebellion. He was born to manners, to mirrors, and to the exhausting weight of royal expectation. But over time, those expectations crumbled like plaque on enamel. By the time he reached the throne in 1901, Edward was no longer the chubby disappointment of his mother's doting disapproval. He was something much stranger, a charming, indulgent, delicately decaying contradiction, one who ruled not from a pedestal, but from the smoking lounge. To the public, he was the jovial king of the good times. He attended races, opened hospitals, shook hands with butchers and bishops, dined late, drank deeply, and smiled through it all with the grace of a man who knew how to wear a hat. But to those closer to his body, his valets, doctors, and tailors, Edward VII was an organism in slow revolt against itself. A hygiene paradox with a monocle. He was born in 1841, the second child and eldest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. From the start, expectations were high. Albert, a precision-loving reformer, wanted his son to be the physical embodiment of modern monarchy. Moral, clean living, intellectually sharp, and, in the most Victorian sense of the word, disciplined. Unfortunately, Edward inherited more from the indulgent side of the gene pool. As a young man, he was sluggish in studies, enthusiastic in leisure, and never quite comfortable in the role of future king. His hygiene habits, even then, were more performative than personal. He could be neatly dressed, well coiffed, and fastidiously groomed, but it was an act of obligation, not instinct. And the older he got, the more the act showed signs of wear. By the 1870s, Edward was a full-blown lifestyle figure. Not a king yet, but a professional prince. Touring colonies, opening exhibitions, appearing at dinners, and always smoking. He was a man of his time and class, a heavy cigar smoker, a loyal patron of gourmet excess, and a nightly participant in long, port-soaked dinners that required entire teams of tailors just to keep his trousers functional. His clothing was immaculate, his presence magnetic. But his personal maintenance became a matter of increasing concern behind palace doors. Let's begin with the teeth. There is no gentle way to put this. Edward VII's mouth was in a state of high-maintenance decay. Like many upper-class Victorians, he grew up before the widespread adoption of modern dental hygiene. Toothbrushes were available, but not standardized in practice. Tooth powders, some of them caustic or sugary, were common. Dentistry, while improving, was still largely reactive. You went to the dentist when something broke, bled, or stank. Edward, like many of his contemporaries, suffered the oral consequences of sweetened diets, tobacco habits, and occasional indifference to brushing. By the time he ascended to the throne, his teeth were in poor condition. He received frequent dental attention, including extractions, fittings, and treatments designed to manage both pain and odor. Royal appointments show multiple consultations with specialists. And still, he smoked. A lot. Some biographers estimate Edward smoked up to 20 cigars and 12 cigarettes a day. The exact count is impossible to verify, and some figures veer into exaggeration. But what's undisputed is the visible impact. His fingers were nicotine-stained. His breath was memorable. His doctors worried. His staff complained discreetly. His valets used scented creams to disguise the residual smell of tobacco that clung to everything from his mustache to his pillowcases. And it wasn't just the smoke. Edward's hygiene habits were erratic. He bathed, yes, but less frequently than the medical community of the early 20th century began recommending. He liked warm baths, sometimes infused with salts or oils, but he also sweated profusely, particularly in his later years, and required frequent linen changes. His shirts were often swapped midday. His collars were specially made to accommodate a thickening neck and increasing body weight, because yes, there was the weight. Edward VII's size was not just a footnote, it was a fact of daily life and royal logistics. By his 60s, he was significantly obese, with a protruding stomach, thick thighs, and swelling in the ankles. His suits were tailored with hidden reinforcements. His chairs were adjusted for support. His carriages were modified to make entry and exit less humiliating. Hygiene in this context was not just about bathing, it was about engineering. Tailors padded and aired his clothes between engagements. Valets brushed dandruff from his collar. His boots were polished, even when they had to be custom widened to fit. His bed sheets were laundered constantly to keep pace with his sweating. And through it all, he was still, technically, clean, but never quite, but fresh. Because here's the thing about Edward VII. He didn't smell dirty. He smelled like someone who had been cleaned up after. There's a difference. His staff worked relentlessly to manage the traces of indulgence. But indulgence leaves residue. Smoke in the fabric, wine in the breath, oil on the skin. He was a man whose hygiene was corrected, not cultivated. And yet the public loved him, because Edward VII did something remarkable. He made monarchy feel human again. After decades of Victoria's veiled austerity, he brought charisma, laughter, and physical presence. His flaws, his girth, his smoking, his appetite, were reframed as warmth. Even his sweat seemed sociable. Newspapers praised his hardy constitution. Dinner guests forgave his cigar-saturated waistcoats. Everyone knew he wasn't the cleanest man in the room. But they liked him anyway. Still, his doctors knew better. They watched his heart strain. They noted the signs of diabetes, of gout, of circulatory problems. They urged him to cut back, on cigars, on food, on late nights. He listened, briefly, then resumed. In the last years of his life, Edward VII's hygiene became more of a maintenance operation than a routine. His bath times were shorter. his grooming more reliant on staff, his breath worsened, his legs ached, his hands swelled, but the tuxedos still fit, barely. The smiles still flashed, tiredly. And the show went on. He died in 1910 at age 68, collapsing after a series of heart attacks. His final hours were attended by family, physicians, and the usual royal retinue, people who knew the choreography of final hygiene. He was washed, brushed, powdered, and arranged. The body was displayed not as it had been, but as it was meant to be remembered, stately, composed, dignified, a contradiction to the end. Because Edward VII's hygiene was never about neglect. It was about maintenance under pressure, the constant behind-the-scenes labor of keeping a man presentable when his habits pushed his body in the other direction, and what followed him was not a return to control, but a tightening of the screws. Because his son, George V, would respond to his father's fleshy chaos by doubling down on discipline, on routine, on order, on the clean-cut austerity of a monarch who clipped his mustache as if shaving the empire itself into shape. Cleanliness in George V's court wasn't comfort. It was command. 23. George V was born into a world that already smelled faintly of soap, starch, and tobacco smoke. By the time he took the throne in 1910, he had inhaled the residue of Edward VII's indulgences and exhaled the dry, bracing chill of self-discipline. Gone were the velvet waistcoats and wine-stained anecdotes. George V would be an emperor in a pressed uniform, his mustache sharp as a razor blade and his hygiene regime a kind of moral mission. Where his father had floated in cigar-scented conviviality, George stood stiff in the drafty echo of duty and expected his entire body to follow. He wasn't glamorous. He didn't want to be. His entire monarchy and his entire personal grooming ethos were built around consistency, containment, and control. This was a king who kept to a schedule so rigid that even his own children were said to flinch when the clocks ticked the wrong way. And within that royal schedule, between letters, shooting trips, and public appearances, was a hygiene routine that was less about sparkle and more about order. It was about maintaining not just his body, but the monarchy's physical credibility. Let's start with his daily ritual. George V's morning began early, often around 7 a.m. He bathed every day, typically in a full tub, warm water, supervised by staff, with towels precisely folded and soap dishes in their proper places. He was known to prefer simple, unscented soaps, no floral extravagance, no lavender pomades, just the basics. The bath wasn't indulgence. It was a sharpening tool, a cold steel rinse to carve away sleep and weakness. After the bath came grooming, brushing the hair, which thinned with time, trimming the nails, by hand, with his own set, and the all-important mustache. The king's facial hair was not just personal style, it was public symbol. He maintained it meticulously. There are stories of him inspecting it in the mirror at multiple angles, combing it with care, and even scolding staff if scissors weren't cleaned properly after use. His mustache wasn't about vanity. It was about readiness. He wore it like a uniform. But even as he projected this polished image, the truth underneath was far more physically strained. Because George V was, quietly and persistently, ill. Decades of heavy smoking, like his father before him, had corroded his lungs. By the 1920s, he suffered from chronic bronchitis and severe emphysema. His voice wheezed, his breath shortened, and all the while, he kept showing up, pressed, clean, and silent about the effort it took. Which brings us to the paradox of his hygiene. He was extremely well maintained, but never quite well. To compensate, his attendants doubled their vigilance. His bath water was monitored for temperature and mineral balance. His toothbrush was replaced frequently. His sheets were changed daily. Linen for George V became a second skin, immaculate, unwrinkled, and often replaced before it had the chance to absorb too much human reality. And yet, there was always human reality. He sweated, he coughed. He had painful varicose veins and circulation problems. In later years, his walking was impaired. He took to wearing orthopedic boots with special inner supports, and even these were shined daily as if they were cavalry spurs. His breath inevitably deteriorated, again, a symptom of smoking. Some accounts suggest that court physicians tried to introduce mouth rinses and mentholated treatments. But George V was stubborn. He didn't believe in fuss. He believed in getting on with it. So the staff got on with it too. They washed his undergarments with a schedule that bordered on military discipline. His dressing room was cleaned twice daily. Servants were trained to keep his toiletries in an exact layout. He even had preferred towels, specific weights, folded to regulation, with no perfume. It wasn't about indulgence. It was about eliminating variables. George V believed in a hygienic monarchy not because he loved being clean, but because there had to be at least one part of the empire that functioned properly. And to his credit, he modeled that function. His children were subjected to the same standard. He reportedly reprimanded his sons if they appeared untidy. "Comb your hair," he was known to say. "You're not a gypsy." An expression of class prejudice, but one that reveals the depth of his grooming obsession. To be unkempt in George V's mind was to be unserious, undisciplined, and therefore unfit to rule. Still, all the linen in the empire couldn't keep his health from failing. By the late 1920s, George's respiratory problems became debilitating. His hygiene routine had to be modified: shorter baths, warmer rooms, more rest between grooming sessions. Nurses were added to the household roster. He continued to bathe, to brush, to change his shirts multiple times a day, but the effort showed. His face paled, his hands shook, his famous mustache grew thinner and grayer, despite the best efforts of oils and combs. There are medical reports suggesting that oxygen was administered in his final years, sometimes hidden behind screens to maintain dignity. His smoking, remarkably, continued almost to the end. And through it all, his body was kept immaculately clean. Because for George V, cleanliness had become more than ritual. It had become resistance, resistance against decline, against disarray, against the creeping chaos of modern life. And yet even his death was an operation of hygiene. He died in 1936 at Sandringham House. His body was bathed, groomed, and dressed for viewing by the very attendants who had served him for decades. There are accounts of how they combed his mustache one last time, as if the empire itself were being folded and put away. He left behind a monarchy that looked cleaner than ever, smooth, unshaken, ceremonial. But beneath the starch was a deeper truth, that this apparent stability had come at enormous cost. George V had used hygiene as armor, as theater, as coping mechanism. His court was spotless, but his lungs were blackened. His children were drilled in manners but emotionally distant. His empire gleamed, even as it frayed at the edges. And then came Edward VIII, his eldest son, a man raised in the same starched shirts, drilled in the same routines, but utterly allergic to the role he was handed. Where George V had trimmed his mustache with national intent, Edward VIII would throw the scissors out the window. He didn't care for schedule. He didn't care for duty. And perhaps, most alarmingly of all, he didn't care for deodorant. 24. Edward VIII. Edward VIII never truly settled into his own skin. Or rather, he settled into it too easily. Where his father, George V, carved discipline into every polished boot and shaved bristle, Edward preferred freedom, ease, comfort. He was the kind of royal who wore his position like an accessory rather than a uniform, something to try on, admire in the mirror, and cast aside when it pinched. And when it came to hygiene, his own, and the rituals expected of kings, he walked a line between casual rebellion and outright neglect. A line that smelled, in more than one sense, like trouble. Born in 1894, Edward was raised in the starched world of Sandringham and Buckingham Palace, a place of early baths, early meals, and precisely folded nightshirts. His father expected discipline. His mother demanded deference. But Edward was not inclined to satisfy either. Even as a child, he chafed at routine. He hated being told when to wash, when to eat, when to comb his hair. He loathed being touched by valets and often tried to dress himself just to avoid them. There are records of servants noting his irregular washing habits even in youth. He would skip baths when he could, resist changing clothes, and roll his eyes at instructions. But he was also charming, devastatingly so. And that charm let him get away with far more than most. In public, Edward was dazzling. He was always stylish, impeccably tailored, and projected the kind of modern royal image Britain desperately wanted in the post-WWI age. Slim, well-spoken, and constantly photographed with a cigarette in hand, he seemed like the monarchy's answer to the Roaring Twenties. But the camera only captured what he wanted it to. Behind closed doors, things were different. Private letters, staff memoirs, and the occasional diplomatic observation all paint a more complex and, frankly, more pungent portrait. By multiple accounts, Edward VIII had a hygiene issue that was less about access and more about attitude. He didn't see the point of daily bathing. He often skipped deodorant. And while his clothes were stylish, they weren't always freshly laundered. A valet once noted that his shirts would sometimes be worn 2 or 3 days in a row, stained at the collar and sleeves, especially during travel. He considered it unnecessary to change unless he was going out in public. And the cigars didn't help. Like his father and grandfather before him, Edward VIII was a heavy smoker. The difference was that he made almost no effort to mask the side effects. His breath was regularly noted by staff and intimates as unpleasant. His clothing carried the smell of stale tobacco. Even Wallis Simpson, the woman for whom he would eventually abdicate, is rumored to have commented, half jokingly, half not, on the stink of smoke and sweat that lingered on his dressing gown. But that wasn't the real scandal. The real scandal was that he didn't care. While previous monarchs had masked their bodily realities behind layers of protocol and discreetly bustling attendants, Edward VIII found all of that boring. He saw fastidious hygiene as outdated. To him, smelling a bit ripe was not a crisis. It was human. And that might have been forgivable if he hadn't also ignored the broader symbolic weight of royal cleanliness. Because here's the thing. Monarchs don't just need to be clean. They need to be seen as clean, regal, composed, in control of themselves, their households, and their sweat glands. Edward VIII, consciously or not, stripped that illusion bare. He didn't want to play the part, and nowhere was that more obvious than in the details of his grooming. He rarely used cologne. He brushed his hair, but didn't obsess over it. He trimmed his nails inconsistently. There were days when staff were forbidden from entering his quarters before noon because he simply didn't feel like dressing. When he traveled, he left behind more than one hotel suite in disarray, not just cluttered but vaguely musty, with damp towels and unwashed underclothes bundled in corners. His hygiene wasn't horrific, but it was decidedly not royal. And this wasn't just the muttering of domestic staff. Diplomats noticed. During his brief reign in 1936, Edward VIII met with multiple foreign dignitaries, and while most were courteous in public, private correspondence reveals an undertone of unease. One French ambassador commented without much delicacy that the king preferred comfort to polish, and another noted that his habit of crossing his legs during meetings wafted more tobacco than charm. A Canadian minister reportedly whispered to an aide that Edward's personal scent was distinct. These were the polite codes of the diplomatic world trying to say what no one dared outright. He smelled off. But the hygiene issue wasn't just about sweat and smoke. It was about discipline, or rather, the lack of it. Edward VIII's casual approach to personal care mirrored his entire approach to monarchy. He saw the institution as stifling, outdated, and irrelevant to modern life. He didn't want to perform the rituals. He wanted to live, to love, to sleep in. to not wash if he didn't feel like it. And so he did. He spent more and more time abroad, especially after meeting Wallace Simpson. The pair vacationed extensively, and Edward often disregarded formal routines while traveling. On yachts, he lounged in the same linens for days. In villas, he bathed irregularly. Even as king, his grooming habits were not refined by power. They were diluted by it. He knew he wouldn't be scolded, and no one wanted to risk offending the sovereign's nostrils with advice about cleaning behind the ears. But eventually, he offended something bigger than a valet. He offended the monarchy itself. Edward VIII abdicated the throne in December 1936 to marry Wallace, a twice-divorced American socialite. The abdication was framed as a romantic tragedy, a constitutional necessity, a historical rupture. But behind the headlines, the palace exhaled, because Edward's departure wasn't just about Wallace. It was about a king who had no interest in embodying the institution, literally or symbolically. He didn't dress like a monarch, didn't speak like a monarch, and certainly didn't smell like one. His brother Albert, soon to be George VI, took up the mantle with reluctant grit. Where Edward had slouched, Albert stood upright. Where Edward skipped rituals, Albert performed them down to the letter. And most notably, where Edward had treated hygiene as an optional formality, George VI reinstated it as a moral contract. Because monarchy, at its core, is about the performance of control over one's words, one's body, and one's image. Edward VIII shrugged that off. George VI picked it back up, wiped it clean, and buttoned it into a uniform. Edward, for his part, lived out the rest of his life as the Duke of Windsor in self-imposed exile across Europe. And even there, in elegant villas with glittering guests, the whispers continued. He still smoked, still sweated, still skipped baths, still wore his shirts a bit too long between washings. In the end, he wasn't dirty. He was resistant to the rituals that made kings palatable. And in that resistance, he may have made monarchy, at least for a moment, human, flawed, tired, and yes, faintly unpleasant to stand next to in a closed room. But the next royal on our list? She wasn't a queen, she wasn't a monarch, but she lived through that same era in a body bound by corsets, protocol, and the quiet tyranny of feminine hygiene. Princess Louise was no rebel, but her body tells a story most textbooks politely skip. 25. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll. Some royals stand tall in the history books, cast in bronze and shadow. Others whisper from the margins, still royal, still burdened with expectation, but slightly out of frame. Princess Louise, the sixth child and fourth daughter of Queen Victoria, belonged to this latter category. She was not the heir. She was not the rebel. She was not the tragic one. Instead, she was the quietly intelligent, fiercely independent, art-loving princess who moved through court life like a woman in gloves too tight, presentable, constrained, and always slightly uncomfortable. But beneath her poise was a body governed by the same rules that had shaped and stifled her mother. Victorian hygiene, feminine modesty, and the suffocating weight of not being allowed to sweat in public. Born in 1848, Louise came into the world at a strange crossroads. The British Empire was approaching its zenith, but the plumbing in Buckingham Palace still groaned with unreliability. The Industrial Revolution had introduced soap as mass commodity, but daily bathing was still suspect for most. And for women, especially royal women, cleanliness was never just about health, it was about performance. Princess Louise's early life followed a strict, unyielding rhythm. Days began early, with water brought in by servants in jugs and basins. The ritual of washing, face, neck, hands, was carefully supervised. Baths were occasional and formal, often involving a tin tub set in the middle of a bedroom and a small army of maids whose presence made modesty nearly impossible. Even within the palace, privacy was a negotiation, not a guarantee. Louise was educated, artistic, and famously opinionated. She was one of the few royal women of her time to pursue formal training in the arts, studying sculpture at the National Art Training School. She fought for intellectual independence, which, at the time, was almost as radical as fighting for the right to change your own underclothes without comment. But despite her progressive leanings, she still lived within the hygienic corset of her era. Let's talk about the actual corsets. Victorian fashion, especially for upper-class women, was a marvel of architecture and denial. Layers upon layers, chemise, corset, petticoats, dress, overskirt, sometimes a bustle, gloves, high-necked collars, and multiple layers of underclothing, all tightly fastened, all designed to keep the body contained. Movement was restricted, airflow was limited, skin contact with sun and wind was minimal, and sweat was unmentionable. Yet the body, famously, does not care about social codes. Louise, like every woman of her class, had to navigate the reality of perspiration, chafing, body odor, and personal hygiene within the confines of clothing designed to suppress all evidence of human function. Bathing was not daily. Instead, the standard was bathing as needed, which for many women meant once or twice a week with daily sponge washing. These sponge baths, known as partial ablutions, were typically performed in private with help from a lady's maid. They involved warm water, soap, cloths, and lots of maneuvering, especially when access to full plumbing was unavailable. We know from household records and surviving letters that Louise was deeply aware of appearances. She kept her hair meticulously styled, an exhausting ritual that could take hours, and involved oils, powders, pins, and often help from multiple staff members. Her clothing was carefully laundered, but not necessarily changed every day. The general norm for women of her station was to wear the same outer garments for several days in a row, unless there was an incident, spilled tea, sudden rain, or unwanted odors. But inner garments told a different story. Underlinen, chemises, drawers, petticoats, was washed far more frequently. Louise, like many of her sisters, would have changed her undergarments daily, and sometimes more than once during particularly hot weather or after events. Why? Because these were the layers closest to the skin, the ones most likely to absorb sweat and oils. They were also the ones that could be discreetly whisked away and replaced without disrupting the performance of constant, effortless grace. And here's the key contradiction of Princess Louise's hygiene experience. She was always being cleaned, but never allowed to seem like she needed cleaning. It wasn't just about keeping clean. It was about concealing the labor of being clean. Hygiene was meant to be invisible. Scented handkerchiefs, floral sachets sewn into corsets, and lavender water behind the ears weren't just charming details. They were survival tactics. Because a whiff of real bodily odor could dismantle the illusion of noble perfection. Louise was also a traveler, and this complicated matters further. As Duchess of Argyll, she spent long periods in Scotland, often in the damp, drafty expanses of Inverarray Castle or on excursions to Balmoral. Travel in the Victorian age was rarely comfortable. Trains, coaches, and ships lacked air circulation, and bathing facilities outside of palaces were minimal. Yet Louise maintained her appearance with the dogged professionalism of someone who had been trained from childhood to never, ever let the curtain slip. Letters from staff mention her quiet fastidiousness. She wasn't vain, exactly, at least not in the same way as some of her royal peers. But she expected clean linens, proper grooming tools, and the privacy to maintain herself. Her brushes, combs, and toiletries were kept in order. Her maids were expected to know her rhythms, and yet, despite all this structure, there was always something fraught about the entire process. Because even as hygiene modernized around her, indoor plumbing, more efficient laundry methods, better soaps, Louise lived in a body trained to think of cleanliness as both obligation and burden. She had the means to be clean. She had the staff. But she never had the freedom to relax into her own skin. Not without someone watching. Not without a script to follow. And that script, like her wardrobe, was heavy. In her later years, Louise's health began to decline. Arthritis, joint pain, and likely other age-related ailments made bathing and dressing more difficult. Servants' memoirs describe her as proud, occasionally irritable but still meticulous. Her hair was thinner, her dresses looser, but the rituals remained. Bath times became shorter. Staff were instructed not to linger. The illusion had to remain intact. Princess Louise was never sick, never sweaty, never flesh and bone. She was a royal lady, which meant, by definition, she was always already clean. She died in 1939 at the age of 91, the longest-lived child of Queen Victoria. By then, the world had changed. The monarchy had changed. Bathrooms had bathtubs. Electric lighting made sweat visible. Deodorants were sold in chemists. But Louise never quite crossed into that modern world. She remained a Victorian in soul and in sponge bath, polished, perfumed, and privately exhausted. Her story is not about shocking scandal. There are no lice infestations, no rotting wounds, no tabloid-ready tales of odor and outrage. What makes her hygiene story compelling is its silence. The decades of constraint, of labor, of holding herself together in a system that demanded bodily perfection but never admitted how much effort it took. Princess Louise was the last on our list, but not the least. She reminds us that even in the absence of filth, there is mystery. Even in the cleanest of lives, there is pressure. Because when you're born royal, hygiene isn't just a habit, it's a performance, one that never ends, even when the curtain falls.